Hey, what's up YouTube? In today's video, I'm going to talk about volumetric clouds, weather systems, weather VFXs, volumetric cloud authoring and baking tools, and so much more. I know there are a lot of existing tutorials on volumetric clouds and whatnot, but first, I feel like the information is really scattered around, and second, the most important steps and principles are often completely skipped in most tutorials I've seen. I'm not gonna lie, most often it feels like you're invited to press a bunch of buttons without really teaching you what they really do. There are for sure great talks and tutorials out there, and this one by Daniel Elliott Jones comes to mind and really helped me get started with volumetric clouds at the time, so shout out to him. Still, I wanted to try and provide something that is a bit more in-depth. Thus, this is my humble attempt at making a video that hopefully packs pretty much everything there is to know about volumetric clouds in Unreal Engine, and weather systems and VFXs to some extent, and I tried to make it as beginner-friendly as realistically possible. Emphasis on realistically. I'll go off track here and there in the video, as usual. If you follow my YouTube channel, you know I don't always make sense and I sometimes gloss over important details. I always try my best to explain everything, but sometimes I also have to make decisions about what I consider important and not as important, and that is of course always very arbitrary. And this video is no different. Hopefully most of it makes sense, but I tried to cover a lot of ground and had to take a few shortcuts here and there, especially regarding the more advanced techniques and complex tools that I cover a bit more briefly in this video. Apologize in advance and feel free to ask in the comments below if you have any questions. Anyway, in this 3 hours long video, I'll first start with very basics, setting up a scene from scratch, adding lights, fog, and a few other fundamental steps. Now, disclaimer, the official documentation on this subject is really good, and I don't see the point in repeating what it says. It obviously doesn't teach you how to create a custom cloud shader from start to finish, like I'll do in this video, but it goes over all the settings, all the console variables, all the optimization tricks done under the hood and their limits, and so forth. Thus, if you're just getting started, I highly recommend you to read the documentation. The first chapter of this video will be a somewhat condensed version of it, although feel free to use the timestamps to navigate through the video and skip the most boring parts. Anyway, next I'll do a bit of theory to explain how everything works under the hood. Having a deep understanding of things always helps. Then I'll demonstrate how to create a volumetric cloud material from scratch, starting with the very basics and ramping up in complexity throughout the video with lots and lots of examples. Next, I'll take a detour to showcase weather effects and plenty of other cool things. I'll then do a few breakdowns of some very interesting tools I built and that you can build as well. I'll also mention weather systems, performance, optimization, and more. Alright, we have a lot ahead of us. Grab a cup of coffee, make yourself comfortable, and let's get started. Oh, and also this video took so long to make, it was actually made in 2 different apartments, and so I had to record in rooms that had very different acoustics, and thus you might experience a different sounding me from time to time. Apologize. Alright, let's go. Let's start from scratch. I'm going to create an empty level and add a directional light actor. In the Atmosphere and Clouds subpanel, I'm going to ensure this directional light is the sunlight. Next, I can choose for this light to cast shadows on clouds, but I feel like that's most often unnecessary. It's rare that an opaque object does need to cast a shadow on clouds, unless it's big enough and high enough in the sky or something. Maybe in certain lighting conditions as well, like at sunset or sunrise, it might be possible that very high mountains should cast a shadow on clouds. But yeah, I feel like this is not the most important option. The tooltip also suggests this is only relevant for the sun, the light index 0. Also, keep in mind that an object casting a shadow on clouds usually means large distances are at play, right? So the light must be properly configured to cast shadows up to that distance, the far shadow feature being a possible solution. Next, same thing but for the atmosphere, so objects can cast a shadow on, well, the atmosphere. So I feel like these 2 settings go hand in hand, either have them both on or off. Keep in mind, each setting comes at a cost, especially shadows, so monitor performance with features on and off and double check they are worth paying for. Speaking of features worth paying for, the next setting allows clouds to cast shadows on the scene, but also on themselves if you're not using ray-traced shadows. If you are, they will be self-shadowed regardless of this shadow casting option. And that setting allows tweaking other settings, like this global shadow strength multiplier. Same thing but specific to the atmosphere, and this is for opaque objects. Next comes depth bias, and I'm honestly not too sure what it's about, but I'm almost certain it's related to artifacts specific to shadow maps. So this is probably useful in very rare occasions to fix depth related imprecisions and whatnot. Next, shadow extent, that's how large the shadow map projection is. The larger, well, the further you can see the shadow map, but obviously the less precise it's gonna get. Using a much smaller area can be a very good way to increase the shadow details, but too small of an area and you can start to see weird things. Seems like the shadow map projection location is snapped to a grid of some sort. And turns out I was right. The projection is indeed snapped to a grid to avoid flickering, so this CVar may need to be tweaked if you do change this setting. Next, you can control the shadow map resolution. And finally, the number of cloud samples to take to render the shadow map. And I feel like this highly depends on your volumetric cloud material complexity. With a simple enough material like this one, the difference between 0.25 and 10 is barely perceptible. So reducing this can also be a good way to gain some performance back. Keep in mind you'll likely want to tweak these settings differently depending on whether you want clouds to cast a shadow on the ground, and that only, or if you need clouds to be self-shadowed as well. Next setting is per pixel atmosphere transmittance, and by the sound of it, is specific to the atmosphere and shouldn't make any visible difference for ground views. Last thing I want to do is to make sure this light is movable to exclusively rely on dynamic lighting features. Next, I'm going to add a skylight actor, and the first important setting is the real-time capture. This is mostly relevant for dynamic day and night cycles or dynamic weather systems that may allow a clear sky to turn into an overcast sky, which should drastically affect the ambient lighting, right? So this setting allows the skylight to capture elements that are considered part of the sky, clouds, the atmosphere, and any material that is tagged as sky, and render them in a cube map to drive the ambient lighting. This is usually very costly, but huge efforts have been made by Epic to make this as optimized as possible. It still comes at a cost, but it's not too bad, especially for next-gen consoles. But as usual, you do you. Don't pay for a feature you don't need. There are of course plenty of interesting settings in the skylight actor, but this is a video about volumetric clouds, so the only other relevant thing is the atmosphere and clouds subpanel. Clouds can cast ambient occlusion, and most settings here should be quite straightforward and are really similar to the directional light cloud shadow settings I just described. Plus the tooltips are great, so I don't have much more to say. Next, I'm going to add a sky atmosphere actor because the volumetric cloud system in Unreal Engine is meant to work in unison with the atmospheric rendering system. Most settings here affect how the light is scattered and absorbed in the atmosphere. If I were to summarize, the Rayleigh scattering is the principle that gives the sky its blue color during the daytime and its red color during sunset and sunrise. And the mist scattering is what creates haze and can be quite relevant when it comes to cloud rendering. This setting may help tie everything together, right? And that's pretty much it. Honestly, I feel like there's not a lot to say here. Again, the documentation is super well made, and as far as I know, if you stick to a ground view, using the sky atmosphere component should be pretty much plug and play, unless you don't want an Earth-like atmosphere, in which case you may need to tweak these settings. However, if you want to see the planet from outer space, some of the optimizations used internally may show their limits. The atmosphere is rendered using lookup tables to be as performant as possible, but that apparently doesn't work too great for planetary views. At this point, the system apparently seamlessly shifts to ray marching and requires per pixel transmittance sampling to avoid certain artifacts. The documentation lists a couple of console variables to account for that specific use case. So yeah, feel free to check what these CVars do and take note of the drawbacks. I feel like planetary views are cool, but it's a bit of a niche feature in my opinion. I'll stick to ground views for today's video. This is also a setting you may want to tweak, and here's a hidden performance versus quality trade-off setting to pay attention to as well. I'm being brief here because we have a lot of ground to cover, and I want to focus on volumetric clouds rather than the atmosphere. I did quite a lot of research to produce this video, and it's my understanding that no setting here, nor any CVar, will magically result in a huge performance boost, because rendering the atmosphere doesn't cost much to begin with, thanks to a crap ton of optimizations, and it looks great from the get-go. Moreover, the engineer or one of the engineers responsible for the atmosphere and cloud rendering system gave a great talk that gives plenty of interesting details on the implementation itself, some of the choices that were made and their consequences. I feel like this paper is complementary to the documentation, link is in the video description below. I also linked many other interesting papers that served as a basis for their implementation. To summarize, if you stick to ground views, besides altering how the atmosphere looks if you really want to, there shouldn't be a lot to do, if anything at all. Next, I'm going to add an exponential height fog actor. It used to be that the exponential height fog was doing its own thing, but now it's by default unified with the sky atmosphere, so you might want to ensure this is indeed the case. Next, ensure both the fog in-scattering and directional in-scattering colors are set to pure black, so that the height fog inherits the color from the sky atmosphere. You may also enable volumetric fog, but no, this has nothing to do with volumetric clouds. This does its own ray marching algorithm in screen space to create volumetric fog and volumetric ray shafts at a short to medium distance on top of the atmospheric rendering, that's all. The main thing to keep in mind when working with volumetric clouds is the fog density and height fall-off, pretty much. Again, the documentation is your best friend here, and I'm sure you're already familiar with this actor anyway. Now is also probably a good time to mention the light mixer and environment light mixer windows. They are great to have all the important settings in one place and can speed up the workflow. Finally, I'm going to add a volumetric cloud actor, and this is where the troubles begin. It comes with a default cloud material that honestly doesn't look too great. How is that material rendered though? On what geometry is it applied? Could it be that this volumetric cloud actor creates some kind of plane in the sky and that this cloud material is applied onto it? Well, it would work, but it would be very limited. For instance, you wouldn't be able to fly through the clouds. You'd see volumetric clouds either when seeing that flat piece of geometry from below or above, but that's it. Now, you might already be confused about what you're seeing here. This is a simple shader that makes use of what's called ray marching. Ray marching is at the heart of volumetric cloud rendering and shares a few similarities with ray tracing. The difference is that instead of tracing a ray just to get the hit result, a ray is traced to accumulate samples along it. The ray origin may be the camera's position or the absolute world position, meaning the pixel location on the rendered surface, reconstructed from the depth buffer, and the ray direction likely is the quote-unquote pixel direction, based on the camera's forward axis and FOV. That direction can be multiplied by some arbitrary distance and added to the ray origin in a loop to march forward on that ray, and each time do something at that location, like sample a 3D texture. More on 3D textures in a second. So it's important to understand that this ray can be traced from any location and in any direction to accumulate samples in a very arbitrary way. You have complete control over the ray march. Thus, this flat piece of geometry isn't necessarily here to tell the shader where to start the ray marching. That information can be very well built from scratch in the shader from any surface, like with a virtual plane coordinates node. That geometry is however needed to have pixels on the screen and to render this ray march shader in the first place, yeah? So it's all about getting the pixel coverage needed to render that volumetric cloud material when clouds should be in view, if that makes any sense. And here, that flat piece of geometry clearly falls short. So, could it be that a cube is used to create that sense of volume? Well, no, not really. Fly through the cube and you wouldn't see the inside of it, so that cloud shader wouldn't be rendered at all. Okay, so you could use a double-sided material or simply invert the normals, but that wouldn't magically solve everything anyway. That cube still has to be in view for the volumetric cloud shader to be invoked. Also, any object inside the cube would prevent the cloud material from being rendered for these pixels, so it would magically occlude any cloud that should be rendered in front of that object. Plus, keep in mind this cloud and atmosphere rendering system work for any point of view, even from outer space. So at ground level, that means the cloud layer is dipping below the horizon, and the system allows for a seamless transition with a high view. So clearly, using a cube to render that cloud material isn't going to cut it. Okay, so could it be that a simple sky sphere is used to draw the cloud material? Well, no. You could, for instance, be high above the clouds and then look at the ground and you wouldn't see the sky sphere anymore. Therefore, clouds would disappear because the cloud material wouldn't be rendered for these pixels. So the only solution is to rely on a screen space effect to render clouds at all times. The volumetric cloud actor creates a single triangle precisely scaled to cover the entire screen, and it is rendered right in front of the camera. Thus, even when looking at the ground, the engine is rendering clouds. However, rendering clouds is expensive, and you wouldn't want to pay that cost when looking at your feet, right? So the way I understand it, the volumetric cloud shader gets the altitude settings, the trace distance and distance mode, and then samples the depth buffer to do a couple of cheap checks first. Does the ray intersect with the cloud layer at all? Is there any object in front of the cloud layer? And so on and so forth. Therefore, it can do an early return if it figures out the ray won't travel through the clouds at all. So rendering clouds is a full screen effect, but you're essentially paying most of the cost only for pixels that do actually need to render clouds. And it's quite important, because the cloud compute shader is no joke. On paper, the principle is, however, nothing too complex. For every relevant pixel, the shader knows the camera's position and the quote-unquote pixel direction, so it simply shoots a ray forward. And that's where these settings come into play. That's how far, in kilometers, the ray is allowed to travel forward. And that setting can be interpreted in two different ways. One, the ray actually starts from the camera, from the point of view. Two, using simple math, the shader can figure out the intersection point with the cloud layer and start the ray from that position instead. And the cloud layer is defined by these two options, also in kilometers. There's the bottom altitude, where it starts, and its height. Note that when the point of view is inside the cloud layer, both modes result in the same start position. Therefore, there's no right or wrong setting here. The tooltip actually suggests when it may be considered best to use which. Thus, this setting should be fine-tuned to best fit the expected ray travel distance, depending on the selected distance mode, and the cloud layer thickness. Keep in mind that when viewed at a steep angle, the ray has to travel further and further to go through the entire cloud layer, right? You may also want to prevent the ray from traveling too far on purpose to occlude clouds in the distance and fall back to a cheaper cloud rendering method, either using billboards, a good old HDR sky map, or any other technique. This other setting may also be fine-tuned to say, hey, the shader computed a ray start position, depending on the distance mode and view context, that is actually too far, so let's not even trace that ray. Again, I feel like that's best used to control distance occlusion culling and fall back to cheaper rendering methods at a far distance. Now, if you're not familiar with ray marching, you may at times experience strange results. See the clouds in the distance tapering off in a strange way? That's actually totally expected and is due to the ray traveling at a steep angle through the cloud layer. Thus, a ray that is stopped due to a max travel distance may not reach the upper layer, and that's where this effect is coming from. I'll do a deep dive into ray marching sooner or later, so get subscribed. Next, this should be quite straightforward, and this option is irrelevant if there's a sky atmosphere in the scene, because this value will have priority over the one you can set in the cloud actor. And like it says, it drives the planet's radius, and thus has an impact on the atmosphere, the way clouds dip below the horizon and plenty of other things. And you might think this makes the cloud shader super complex and all, but no, quite the opposite. By default, the world origin, 000, is considered to be at the top of the planet. Thus, based on the planet radius and cloud bottom and top altitudes, the cloud shader can do two super cheap ray sphere intersection tests to figure out where the ray starts and ends in the cloud layer. Next is the ground albedo. You'll see in a minute that the cloud shader has a built-in option to fake the sunlight bouncing off of the ground and reaching the clouds from below. And because it would simply be too expensive and complex to compute what the actual ground color is for each cloud sample, especially for a 3D planet, the ground albedo is instead approximated using a constant color. So if you're building a landscape mostly composed of grass, forests and whatnot, I suppose this should be somewhat greenish. Feel free to experiment with it. Next, that's an option you'll likely need for planetary views and that case only, although its effect may be slightly perceived at sunset as well. But I'd argue you can likely leave it disabled for ground views. Note that it requires the volumetric cloud materials grayscale optimization to be disabled. More on that in a minute. Next, this simply controls the amount of bottom occlusion and is ignored if you provide the volumetric cloud material any ambient occlusion value. Not something I'll cover in today's video, but it's a behavior you can override. I find the default ambient occlusion good enough, so most of the time I don't plug anything into this pin. Next comes important settings for quality and performance. So basically, the cloud compute shader is allowed to take a number of samples per ray. The more the better, but the more expensive, obviously. And each of these settings is a simple multiplicator for the max sample count. It's still clamped by a global maximum value that you can tweak using a CVar, more on that later on. So this is for the actual view, what you see in the viewport. That's for clouds rendered in reflections. That's for the cloud shadows, if using ray-marked shadows, more on that in a second. And same thing but for cloud shadows rendered in reflections. And in a nutshell, keep them as low as possible. Find the right balance between an acceptable noise amount and performance. But I'll go back to visual quality and performance later on. Next, still if using ray-marked shadows, you should definitely fine-tune how far that secondary ray is able to travel towards the light. Ray-marked shadows are expensive, so it's important to take as few samples as possible. Thus, if the shadow ray has to travel very far in the cloud layer, the few samples might miss most clouds and the resulting shadow might not make much sense visually. Plus, this should definitely be fine-tuned according to the cloud layer thickness. There's no point in having the shadow ray traveling huge distances if the cloud layer is very thin. So this setting can have a huge impact on the perceived shadow quality. And it can be a good idea to keep the shadow ray distance somewhat short, to at least allow clouds to be decently self-shadowed, and maybe not care as much about shadows coming from nearby clouds. It's a trade-off. Finally, there's one more important setting regarding performance. Basically, this tells the shader, hey, the ray has accumulated enough quote-unquote data. It can stop now because accumulating more samples isn't going to result in any visible difference. Voila for the basic setup and basic settings. The rest happens in the cloud material and via console commands. And if you already feel overwhelmed with the amount of settings, don't worry. The default values work just fine to get started, so don't sweat it. We'll get back to settings and CVars later on. This was just an introduction of some sort. Now is the time to pay attention though. Let's create a volumetric cloud material. So here's a blank material. The first step is to change the material domain to volume and the blend mode to additive. This should be ticked as well, but the engine should be smart enough to automatically tick this for you sooner or later. And if you're using Substrate, all you got to do is use the Volumetric Fog Cloud BSDF node. Also, obvious but important step, use that for now blank material in the Volumetric Cloud actor. Alright, so a volumetric cloud material expects a couple of extra settings that are not exposed here. Therefore, you're invited to add a volumetric advanced output node to the graph. Feel free to create scalar parameters to control each of these. The tooltips are, for once, very well made, so make sure to read them. There are no right or wrong values here, as long as you stay within the expected range. They play quite an important role, at least visually, especially under certain lighting conditions, because they tell the shader how the light is scattered by the water droplets. I'd recommend tweaking them once you're at least halfway there with your cloud material though. Doing that too early might just be confusing in my opinion, but they do play an important role, so keep them in mind. Be aware that they don't have any effect on performance, except this one, but I'll get back to it in just a second. It's complicated. For now, let's focus on these settings. So the grayed out parameters are these ones. Next, this setting here allows for the phase to be evaluated multiple times as the ray travels forward, instead of just once per ray. It results in a more accurate light behavior, but it comes at a cost. I couldn't notice any visible difference with and without it, to be honest, but your mileage may vary. This is also a visual quality versus performance trade-off setting. The value goes from 0 to 2, 2 being considered as expensive. Again, I feel like this is something to tweak once you're done with your cloud shader, depending on the budget you have left. Keep it at 0 if you're happy with how it looks, or try increasing it to 1 or 2 if you can afford it. Next setting is ground contribution, and that's where this setting I explained earlier comes into play. And this also comes at a cost, so try with and without. Next, grayscale material. As far as I know, this setting discards the green and blue channels of some internal values initially expressed as RGB, like the albedo. This is a minor optimization. Try with and without, and see if the difference justifies the cost. Oh, and speaking of albedo, let's right away set a constant value of 1.0. This should be the right value for most use cases, but I'll explain a few tricks regarding the albedo later on. So just to reiterate, to use an actual color for the albedo, this must be false. Next setting allows for shadows to be ray marched for every sample. This is like a loop within a loop, so I don't have to tell you this usually makes the shader tremendously more expensive. It does result in a very noticeable difference though, but for ground views, if you can live with the cheaper look, consider using the beer shadow map instead. It's night and day performance-wise. And again, if using the shadow map, the settings to tweak are located in the directional light. And that light has to cast cloud shadows in the first place, obviously. Finally, this has to do with the multi-scattering, making clouds brighter and brighter as you increase the number of octaves. You can either remain in charge of that brightness, or just ensure it's clamped to a 0 to 1 range. Alright, time to dive into this conservative density pin because it's super important and most tutorials I've seen simply don't pay any attention to it. Volumetric clouds are typically super duper expensive to render. It's only thanks to the performance boost in recent GPUs and many optimization and approximation tricks that it's now doable in real time. It's still, however, considered somewhat expensive. One optimization trick is to rely on dynamic branching to allow the GPU to compute only the most expensive part of the shader when needed. Basically, when a ray is traced, samples are taken at discrete intervals. And it'd be ideal to take samples only where there are clouds and skip the empty space. However, there's no way to know where clouds are unless you first take a sample, right? So a solution is to first sample a simplified version of the cloudscape, if you will, and if and only if that sample ends up in a cloud, evaluate the full shader and sample the more expensive cloudscape with more precision. And this pin is a hack to expose this mechanism, this dynamic branching to the material graph. You can see this pin as a way to send the shader that simple cloudscape. Then, when the shader is fully evaluated, when a sample is inside a cloud, further refine that simple shader with extra details and whatnot. So it's important to understand this is mostly a subtractive workflow. You'll often hear the term eroding clouds, and that's where it's coming from. You can't add to this conservative density because it's the only thing the shader sees at first. Only when a sample is inside that simple shape, can you provide the shader with more information, so you can't magically add density outside this volume, if that makes any sense. You can only remove density from that volume, aka erode clouds. Well, I mean you could erode clouds and then add some details back, you get my point. You're bound by this conservative density. Keep in mind, eroding clouds work best with soft density gradients, so the outer volume gets eroded first. Oh, and by the way, this conservative density, this dynamic branching mechanism, can be visualized using this debug view. To summarize, the goal is to construct the density of a rough, simple cloudscape and feed that into the conservative density's red channel. You may use the other channels to pass data along as well, but that's usually for more advanced use cases. I'll explain. Next, get that conservative density and erode the simple cloudscape with more texture samplers and whatnot. You may also retrieve the data sent in the other channels and do stuff with it. So that's the idea. Let's give it a go then, shall we? I'm going to use the absolute world position, and that tells me where each sample is in 3D space during the ray march. Speaking of world position, new things came into light with UE 5.4 regarding large world coordinates, and this article is worth the read. To keep things simple for now, I'm going to ignore the Z component and use the X and Y coordinates to sample a 2D texture. I purposely selected a simple black and white mask texture to more easily illustrate what's going on. Right now, this position is in centimeters, so I just need to divide it to scale the texture up. And because we are working with very large scales here, clouds do stretch over kilometers after all, this is a good opportunity to use the built-in kilometer to centimeter material function. It just divides by 100 thousandths, that's all. It spits out a scalar value though, so it only works with scalar values. For vectors, just divide by 100k manually, same thing. So this texture is going to tile, say, every 2 kilometers. By the way, I may visualize this texture coordinates using the albedo, like so. And that's where the cloud layer altitude setting plays an important role. Right now it's quite high, so let's bring that cloud layer much closer to the ground. Cool. So using these UVs, I'm going to sample this 2D texture to drive the conservative density. And for now, that's the only thing I'm going to work with. I'm not going to erode the base shape to create a more intricate cloud shape yet. So I can just forward the conservative density as is to the extinction pin. And that's the result I get. I'm simply going to bump up the amount of samples just to have something more pleasing to look at for now. I'll focus on performance and noise later on. So right now I'm just feeding the shader a value of 1.0, but that's incredibly dense. This essentially tells the shader the amount of water droplets in the air. So let's multiply this by, say, 0.05. Much better. The lower the density, the less the light is affected by the scarcer water droplets. Having less density, thus softer clouds, also helps to reduce noise. So to summarize, for each pixel on the screen, a ray is traced. Along that ray, once in the cloud media, samples are taken at regular intervals. For each sample, I get its 2D position, remapped from centimeters to kilometers, so I have a range that makes much more sense to map this 2D texture across the sky. And this is repeated for each sample. Thus, essentially, this results in this 2D texture being projected from top to bottom across the entire cloud layer. And that's the density this ray should encounter along its path. And that's precisely what I get. A 2D disk extruded in Z gives me a cloud in the shape of a cylinder. It's pretty boring, I know, but it's going to help me explain and visualize a couple of tricks. Speaking of tricks, I can access very useful information using the Cloud Sample Attributes node. Again, for once, tooltips are great, so might as well read them. Basically, that's the altitude relative to the ground at each sample, that's the altitude relative to the cloud bottom layer, that's the normalized altitude in the cloud media, 0 at the bottom and 1 at the top, and that's how far the shadow ray has traveled in the cloud media regardless of the shadow technique used, Beer shadow map or ray traced shadows. As the tooltip says, it could be used as an optimization trick to sample lower MIPS at certain distances and whatnot. Most often, you'll be interested in the normalized altitude layer. For instance, using that 0 to 1 altitude gradient, I can derive a bilinear gradient and use it to modulate the density resulting from the 2D texture top-down projection in Z. And voila, the density is progressively decreased near the top and bottom part of the cloud layer. And that's the cheapest way to create 3D clouds. The cloud shape comes from a cheap 2D texture sample, and extra Z information is mathematically derived to control the density along the altitude. Using math can be a bit limiting though. The normalized altitude can instead be fed to a curve atlas raw parameter to sample a color curve and thus give you much greater control over the cloud density in Z. And if you're not familiar with the curve atlas asset type, don't worry, I'll explain in greater detail in just a second. Better, using a texture, I can create a cloud profile. This axis is a normalized altitude from top to bottom. And that axis is a normalized distance to the center. That's the cloud's outer edge, and that's its center, right? For the normalized altitude axis, that I know how to get, and that's the v-axis. What about the distance to the center though? Well, if you thought about distance fields, you're right. Assuming this is the shape of my cloud, that could be its distance field, right? The inverse distance field actually, 1 at its center point, 0 at its edge. Therefore, I can simply sample this value and use it to construct the u-axis. Something's wrong though. I can see some kind of shape, but it's barely perceptible and it reacts very bizarrely to the lighting. Okay, so this distance field is used as a u-axis to map the profile texture, right? That means all around the cloud, this value is 0, meaning pixels are sampled right there in the profile texture. The thing is, that's in between pixels, in between the first column of pixels and the one before it. And by default, the GPU wraps mapping coordinates, so the previous column of pixels is that one, texture style, right? So the sample right there results in a mix of black and white, gray. Meaning there's a cloud density likely close to 0.5 across the entire sky, hence the strange result. To fix this, just have to use clamp addressing to go from a tiling profile texture to this, and voila. Oh, but it's upside down, yeah? That's because 0 in texture space is at the top, so just have to do a 1- on the normalized altitude and that's it. See, the cloud is precisely shaped according to this profile. This obviously looks ridiculous, but you get the idea. You can of course push the idea further, maybe use the RGB channels to create different 2D distance fields and different 2D profiles. You'll need to sample the profile texture 3 separate times though, but that may allow you to create more complex cloudscapes and have complete artistic control over it. Working with textures also means you can replace textures with render targets, and thus you can create tools in engine to draw these masks and literally paint clouds. And I know they look like hot garbage, but that's almost done on purpose. I wanted to keep these examples as simple as possible so you can hopefully make sense of what I'm trying to demonstrate, and for that demo project to remain as educational as possible as well. Anyway, you can also create some sort of storm system to paint specific cloud shapes here and there in the sky using actors and whatnot, but more on these tools later on. Using a 2D texture is not the only way to derive a cloud profile based on the altitude though. There are other solutions. You can use a curve to remap the distance field along the altitude. So create a linear color curve, use the red channel to make clouds, say, thick at the base, thinner in the middle and thicker at the top. Append that curve in a curve atlas parameter. drag that asset in the material graph and sample it using the normalized altitude. Then use a remap function or a smooth step function like so. And voila. Therefore, you can use the 3 remaining channels to encode extra data in the cloud profile. Maybe a density multiplier, maybe another curve to control some kind of erosion effect that you'll add to create wispy shapes around the bottom and billowy shapes near the top. There are plenty of things to try here and many ways to derive the cloud profile with the altitude. This approach is common practice in the video game industry and is commonly known as the cloud profile lookup table or cloud vertical profile gradient. You may even create several profiles and lerp from one profile to the other to change the weather. That lerp can also be driven by some kind of 2D mask texture projected across the entire sky dome to change the weather spatially. Just have to ensure the cloud's profile can be interpolated from one to another in a way that makes sense. Maybe to go from thin clouds to thick clouds, unlike the random crap I did here. That texture may then even be dynamically created by a weather system at runtime or something, and this seems to be the go-to solution in the video game industry. For instance, Horizon and Red Dead Redemption both use a method similar to this. The implementation may slightly vary from game to game, but that's the principle. Now that's kinda cool, but it may be a bit limiting though. You can do a lot with cloud profile lookup tables, but more intricate shapes may be hard to create with this technique. What if the Z profile could be embedded into the 2D texture to create more complex shapes? Well, that's where 3D textures come into play. A 3D texture is essentially a bunch of 2D textures stacked on top of each other. And with such texture, your GPU can interpolate pixels in 2D as well as in between slices, so you essentially get a smooth 3D volume from a bunch of 2D slices. For the sake of keeping things simple for now, I'm going to use a simple 3D sphere texture. I baked one using a super duper simple Niagara emitter made of a single simulation stage to draw a sphere into a volume render target. It's not really that interesting, so I'll gloss over it. This 3D texture sampler now expects UVW coordinates. So let's simply append the normalized altitude to this 2D position. And voila, a spherical cloud. Now, instead of using the normalized altitude, I can simply use the sample's XYZ position. Note that the normalized altitude value is in a 0 to 1 range, so when using it as a W coordinate to sample this 3D texture, the cloud's bottom layer is guaranteed to correspond to the bottom of the 3D volume texture and the top layer to the top, if that makes sense, right? Using the sample's Z position, that's now going to be arbitrary. That Z position, scaled by that amount, is going to result in a W coordinate that is hard to predict. So I can, for instance, offset it, and that's going to scroll the 3D texture in Z. And I can also further scale it in Z, right? Note that the 3D texture tiles in Z just like it tiles in X and Y. If you want to prevent this texture from tiling, you may simply occlude clouds at a distance. Or use clamped addressing. Or create a box mask. Now, you don't typically need an independent XYZ scale control, so what I like to do is to use a single vector parameter, the RGB channels for an XYZ offset, and the alpha channel for the scale. Voila. Alright, let's start creating some actual clouds. A 3D texture in the shape of a cloud can be used to create a custom shaped cloud, right? But the density is very uniform, because this 3D texture is like a binary thing, 0 or 1. There's no gradient to work with to vary the density, yeah? So a common solution is to use a 3D distance field. You may use your favorite DCC software to model a 3D cloud using voxelization, noise displacement and whatnot. That mesh can be imported in UE to render a 3D distance field using different means, like geometry scripting or Niagara. I've actually built a tool to do just that. It's slow, but it works. Having to import a 3D mesh in UE just to generate a distance field gets old real fast. So I feel like it's best if you can do that directly in your DCC software. Houdini can do that, of course. What can it do? And other softwares as well, I'm sure. Blender though? Nope. Not that I'm aware of, at least. However, you can hack something together using geometry nodes. And I'll do a short follow-up video to explain how I built this. It's available in early access on my Patreon, by the way. Anyway, that texture contains a bunch of 2D distance fields that can be stacked on top of each other to create a 3D distance field. And so I now have a gradient to work with to control the cloud density, remap the range at will, tweak the fall-off, erode it, and so on and so forth. Cool stuff. Now, to create an entire cloudscape with this technique is challenging. Creating detailed enough clouds that span across a few kilometers may require a 3D distance field texture that simply has too many voxels, even when using an erosion pass to add details at a medium and small scale. A large 3D texture requires a lot of memory, too much, most often. Now, creating an interesting cloudscape is all about combining different techniques to create many layers. And this 3D texture approach is most often best used to create hero clouds, big storm cells, and very distinctive cloud shapes, to have artistic control over the macro details and most important features of your cloudscape, right? That way you can keep the 3D texture resolution low enough, because the rest, the smaller and more detailed clouds, are most often generated procedurally using 3D noise textures. So time to dive into 3D noise textures. You may generate a tiling 3D noise texture using UE or any other software. It's however often not super straightforward to do so, therefore I'm going to suggest an alternative. UE's Volumetric plugin comes with a couple of 3D textures that are great to start with. Especially this one. It contains Perlin Worley Noise at different frequencies, like suggested in the Horizon paper. So copy these textures in your project, disable the Volumetric plugin if you don't need it anymore, and voila, you can start fooling around with 3D noise textures. So let's do that. Oh, and just before that, you might also want to take a look at this zip file. It's been kindly released for free by Andrew and is the result of the voxel upscaling technique they came up with for Horizon Forbidden West. Very interesting noise patterns. Anyway, moving on. Here I'm simply sampling that Worley volume textures red channel using the absolute world position remapped from centimeters to kilometers. The noise is then further remapped to control the cloud coverage. That is plugged into the conservative density, which is in turn modulated and plugged into the extinction pin. Nothing fancy. That's quite random looking, but you get the idea. The cloud density now comes from that 3D noise, and you can remap that noise at will to tweak the cloud coverage. Now let's erode the density. First, I want to fine-tune the density over the altitude. I want a very slight density fade-in at the bottom and quite a long and smooth fade-out at the top. Then I can remap that density to sharpen the density gradient and ensure erosion mostly takes place on the outside. Now, subtracting from the conservative density is one way to apply erosion, but another and possibly superior way is to use remapping again. This prevents density from being removed from the inner core of the cloud, which looks unnatural. Now, this setup may seem daunting to some of you, but it's not that bad. I'm using the same 3D texture as before. Its green, blue and alpha channels contain Worley Noise of increasing frequencies. Using Worley Noise for erosion gives you wispy shapes, and using inverted Worley Noise gives you billowy shapes. Thus you can lerp from one to the other using the normalized altitude to create wispy shapes at the bottom and billowy shapes at the top. And then you can use the low-frequency Perlin Worley Noise embedded in the red channel to lerp between two Worley frequencies, just to add a bit of randomness to the picture. Voila, this simple setup adds quite a bit of detail and doesn't look too bad. And that's really just an example of what you can do with erosion. Feel free to experiment on your own. To create a realistic and interesting looking cloudscape, it's important to take note of what happens in real life, as usual. What's out there is the best source of inspiration. Clouds come in many different shapes, and most of these shapes can be seen at very specific altitudes. For instance, you may take a look at this image and simplify the presented model. Maybe choose the 3 most common forms of clouds to create 3 different cloud layers, right? Now, remember, this normalized altitude value is in a 0 to 1 range, starting from the bottom of the cloud layer and ending at the top. And you'd be tempted to think that you need multiple cloud layers to recreate this layered cloud effect. Well, no. You can simply remap this single 0 to 1 altitude range to any range. Say from 0 to 0.1 is actually the 0 to 1 range of a first layer. 0.3 to 0.6 is the 0 to 1 range of a second layer, and 0.7 to 1.0 for a third and final layer. Why not? And you may visualize these layers like so. And so these 3 layers could be used to mask the density of 3 different 3D textures to create different cloud shapes, right? Maybe the bottom layer is more affected by wind, and thus has a more wispy look to it. You get the idea. You could also use these layers to sample 3D distance fields at specific altitudes and whatnot. This is probably the most straightforward way of remapping the normalized altitude, but you can of course go crazy and build all kinds of gradients thanks to math. Desmos is an awesome website that lets you create and visualize equations. And assuming this is the 0 to 1 normalized altitude I'm working with, I could, say, remap it to a certain range. Then I could convert it to a triangle signal. And using a bit of extra math, I could add a parameter to control where that triangle quote-unquote spike is. That way, I could assume the clouds at the bottom of that cloud layer expand really rapidly with the altitude, and then more gradually afterwards, if that makes sense. And that triangle signal could then easily be turned into some kind of smooth curve. Using a material function and nodes, this equation translates to this graph. That's the 0 to 1 normalized altitude of the remapped cloud layer, and that's the density along the vertical axis in that cloud layer. So it starts at 0 at the bottom, quickly reaches 1, and fades out to 0 at the top. Okay, cool, but what's the purpose of this function? Well, let's make use of it. Here I create a conservative density using a very simple 2D texture. That results in a top-down extrusion, like I explained earlier, right? Now let's create the cloud vertical profile using this material function and a remap function. You can see that the cloud profile quite closely matches the triangle function, right? Very steep at first, to mimic that layer of cold air, resulting in a lot of condensation quite abruptly, and then quite mellow at the top. That's the cloud profile. The density is still uniform across the entire cloud layer. So let's simply multiply the resulting vertical profile with the same function to fade in and out the density along the altitude. And that lets me apply a simple erosion path and create somewhat decent cumulus clouds. I won't explain this erosion setup as it's nearly identical to the last one I explained. The only new and interesting bit here is that the remapped normalized altitude is now packed in the conservative density screen channel and retrieved here so as to not recompute it in the fully evaluated shader. But I'll have more to say about this technique later on. Anyway, the result is not that terrible looking, right? It's decent. And this is super duper cheap. The conservative density is made up of simple math and a single texture sample. And the erosion is done with a single 3D texture sample, which is arguably as cheap as a decent erosion pass can be. Moreover, you can create multiple cloud layers for not a lot more cost. Simply create a second layer at a different altitude, sample a second channel in that texture to create a second cloud vertical profile from a second coverage signal, and merge the two. The erosion pass is applied to both layers at the same time. There's only a tiny bit more math to the shader, but no extra texture samples, so it remains cheap. And you have two cloud layers, cool. Keep in mind, I'm merely trying to show you every technique that comes to my mind, and using math to create layers is a viable option, but using a cloud profile lookup texture to control what happens at what altitudes and create different cloud layers, like I explained earlier, is probably the superior way. I feel like you can only do so much with mathematically derived gradients. I'd argue it's quite easy to create random looking clouds from a bunch of noise textures, and it can do the job well enough. Recreating a realistic cloudscape and all the variation it comes with, in shapes and density, requires much more work though. A cloudscape is a very organic thing. It's driven by complex fluid mechanics, it has rules, layers, and using random looking noise textures without much thought can only get you so far. I feel like mastering the idea that airflow, pressure and temperature drastically vary with altitude, and thus drastically change the way clouds form and evolve, is key in creating decent cloudscapes. So feel free to use and abuse the normalized altitude pin to modulate all kinds of parameters in your cloud material. Density, distortion, erosion, flow, shapes and whatnot. Really, the key is in creating layers of different and distinctive clouds. And speaking of layers, it's often considered best practice to create the thinnest clouds using a simple translucent material applied on a sky sphere or some kind of flat plane high in the sky. These clouds are so thin they don't need any parallax effect and don't exhibit a complex light scattering behavior, so a complex ray marching algorithm isn't required. A simple translucent material can do the job well enough. However, like explained in the Horizon paper, you may very well do a separate ray march in the translucent material and take just a few steps to simulate light scattering in the thin cloud layer and trace shadows, why not, in the hope of unifying the look and lighting behavior of volumetric and translucent clouds. I won't dive into this HLSL code because it's sketchy AF and just a hasty experiment on my side to add fake shadows. Keep in mind you can get access to some of the sky atmosphere data in materials, so that may help you get started in creating translucent clouds that look similar to the volumetric ones, so they have the same color, lighting and whatnot, right? You might also be interested in having that upper cloud layer deep below the horizon the same way volumetric clouds do, something you can easily do with a vertex shader and a subdivided plane like so. Alright, let's dive deeper. Let's add motion. The simplest method to animate the cloudscape is to shift the UVW coordinates using a direction multiplied by time multiplied by a speed parameter. This can also be done separately at a different speed for the erosion pass to add secondary motion. And actually this may often be done only for the erosion pass, not necessarily because of the cost, but for artistic reasons. A cloudscape is often art-directed. Even when dynamically generated with an intricate weather system, that system is probably tailored according to the art department to generate specific outputs and work within certain limits, to make sure it generates interesting features at all times and whatnot. Thus, you likely don't want these features, these hero clouds or whatever, to drift away with the wind. Instead, you probably want to give the player the impression that clouds are moving with the wind, and applying wind on the erosion path helps do that, as well as provides a tiny performance boost by keeping the conservative density as cheap as possible. Again, you likely want to concentrate the cost of your shader on the erosion path. Now, supporting wind that can change direction can be tricky for reasons I explained in detail in a previous video. The easiest method is to use a material parameter collection and increment a global XYZ offset based on delta time, speed and direction. There are of course many ways to go about this. Here I simply rely on a timeline component added to the level blueprint to generate a pseudo-random direction. Direction multiplied by an arbitrary speed to increment a value stored in a material parameter collection. Oh, and it looks like I forgot to use delta time, never mind. With this technique, the wind direction can be changed at runtime. It's cheap, but it has its limits because it's a global effect. To control the wind speed and direction locally, flow maps can be used. I've done an extensive video on flow maps and tools that can be created to paint flow maps in Engine, so feel free to give it a watch. Now, keep in mind, ray-marched clouds are expensive. It likely requires many costly texture samples per pixel, and using a flow map adds even more texture samples. So it shouldn't be done without making sure the added cost fits into your budget. Anyway, a flow map can be used to sample the main density layer. And I'll gloss over the details because using flow maps has been a subject of a previous video of mine. The erosion path can also make use of a separate flow map if it can be afforded. With this technique, more complex motion can be created, as you can see. Wind is not a global force that goes in one single direction. It's a flow of air that can be affected by the landscape topology and so many other things, and you can mimic that behavior with flow maps. Cool. Now, keep in mind we're working in 3D space here. This is a volume material. This volume texture expects UVW coordinates. So these coordinates can be offset in 2D using a 2D flow map, but can be offset in 3D as well, meaning the flow map's blue channel can be used to add a flow direction in Z. Here I'm using the blue channel only to add vertical motion in some areas. It's quite bizarre looking, but it's to illustrate the idea. It's also possible to use a 3D flow map to very precisely control how clouds move in 3D space. This is a bit more expensive, but it's a technique worth knowing if you ever need to create a cloudscape with a very specific and complex 3D motion. You can of course create tools in Engine to paint flow maps. I've experimented with all sorts of techniques, all documented on my YouTube channel. So yeah, you can literally paint the cloudscape motion. Quite cool. But let's keep it simple for now. Distortion can be added in a similar way motion is added. It's just a matter of manipulating the coordinates used to sample these different textures. You can say, hey, that world position at that sample is going to be shifted in X, Y, and Z based on some kind of RGB noise. And that induces distortion, right? So you can use textures akin to flow maps to distort mapping coordinates in 2D, or use 3D flow maps or 3D noise textures to do that in 3D. That's one way to add wispiness to the clouds. You can distort coordinates used to sample the volume texture that drives the erosion, and that can create interesting shapes. Keep in mind this creates dependent texture fetches. For this texture to be sampled, this one has to be fetched from memory to be sampled first. So there's extra latency that comes with that kind of technique. And that's where it's best to leverage the dynamic branching that is exposed to you, right? Avoid doing that when constructing the conservative density, and do that kind of technique only when the shader executes the more expensive branch. Distortion, just like any other effect, can and probably should be based on the altitude. This comes back to a cloudscape being a very organic thing, made of several different cloud types, all located at specific altitudes, and so driving the displacement, flow, erosion, or any effect with the altitude can be a good way to enhance realism. Now, I've explained how a 3D distance field texture can be used to create custom-shaped clouds. But it's not the only way. You can use math to generate 2D and 3D shapes. This website is probably the best resource you can find on distance fields. Link is in the video description below. So let's say I want to create a cloud in the shape of a donut. The proper name would be a torus. Well, this is a function that basically says, here's how distant the given sample location is to the torus, given the torus major and minor radiuses. So let's copy that code into a custom node. Convert the code from GLSL to HLSL, meaning just have to change this to that. Next, add the necessary inputs, P for the sample position, and T for the radiuses, and voila. That distance field function can be used to drive the cloud density and create a torus in the sky. What next? Well, for instance, you could want to derive the torus normal. That's a little bit costly though, and that's, once again, where you can leverage this dynamic branching feature. Meaning, send the density in the conservative densities red channel, like I explained so far, then compute the normal and pack it in the 3 remaining channels, green, blue and alpha. It can then be retrieved in the expensive branch, like so. This setup prevents this calculation to be done for these finer samples, what I call the expensive branch, right? You could then derive the torus tangent and thus the binormal as well. I won't have much use for them though. I merely wanted to show you how the conservative density extra channels can be used to forward data to the expensive branch. Anyway, what I'm going to do, however, is to derive the torus toroidal and poloidal coordinates. Disclaimer, I'm no math head, and the method I'm going to show you is quite expensive. There's probably a better solution I'm not aware of. Feel free to let me know in the comments below. So that be the toroidal coordinate in a 0 to 1 range, and that be the poloidal coordinate, also in a 0 to 1 range. Note the use of 2 at 2 nodes. I wanna puke, don't do this. Anyway, finally, that's the normalized distance to the torus center. 3 coordinates to create UVW mapping coordinates to sample this 3D texture and erode the torus. See, I can scroll the 3D texture along that axis, along that second axis as well, and along the third and last axis. Which means I can use time to offset the texture coordinates and create a rolling and spinning donut cloud. I can also use a 3D noise texture to distort the coordinates used to compute the torus distance field, to, well, distort it. The normalized distance to the torus center can then be used to drive 2 different colors, why not? And the emissive channel can also be used to emit light from the torus center. Quite cool. Keep in mind that all the techniques I'm showing you today can be combined to create very complex cloudscapes. And to illustrate that, let's do one more example. Here I could use a cylinder distance field, but I don't really care about the end caps, so an infinite cylinder will do the trick. I merely want to stretch this tornado from top to bottom, right? Speaking of bottom, the cloud layer starts at the ground level for this tornado to be grounded, similar to the distant rain technique I explained earlier. So here I'm just doing a 2D distance check to create the tornado's distance field. And the distance is interpolated using the normalized altitude to create the tornado's shape. And that's the conservative density. So next comes erosion, and the first challenge, as usual, is to create UVW mapping coordinates for the 3D noise texture. So here's the normalized altitude, that's one axis. That's the toroidal coordinates, the second axis, and it's added to the normalized altitude to create a vortex. And the third and last axis is the distance to the tornado's center. Add a bit of noise to distort coordinates. Shift mapping coordinates with time, and voila. Cool. Now, you may want to increase the scrolling speed from top to bottom though, to maintain angular momentum or something. Sadly, that's not as easy as interpolating the speed from top to bottom though. That creates infinite divergence in the mapping coordinates, so you kinda have to duplicate this entire setup, use a specific speed for the top layer, and another speed for the bottom layer and interpolate the two using the normalized altitude. This is obviously costly, but it's sadly the only way. Well, meh. You could use a speed for the upper part and a speed for the lower part and use boundary jitter using blue noise and whatnot to create a blend. But this has its limits and can look noisy. It's however a trick used in the Horizon DLC to make the Megastorm a bit cheaper for PS4. Cool trick. Next, similar to the Torus example, you might want to emit light from the tornado's center. Why not? And again, this can be combined with other techniques. Here I'm sampling a 3D noise texture using the world position. Very simple. The result is masked using the normalized altitude, remapped to create clouds quite high in the cloud layer. And that's added to the conservative density, but each separate effect is also sent along in separate channels to isolate certain effects. For instance, I want this spinning erosion effect to be applied on the tornado and tornado only, so I can get the isolated tornado density and apply the erosion. Next, add the isolated cloud density as is, without erosion because I don't care, to reconstruct the final cloudscape. Quite complex, but hopefully you get the idea. It's so cool what you can do with volumetric clouds, and I can't emphasize enough how important it is to understand this conservative density mechanism. I can show you one more method to create and sample 3D clouds, and that's using the VDB file format. It's a file format purposely made to very efficiently store 3D data, created by DreamWorks and first used in 2011, according to Wikipedia. You can find VDBs for free online, link will be in the description below, but you can also create them. Both UE and Blender support VDBs, and the workflow is quite simple. The idea is to first model some kind of cloud. Feel free to use displacement modifiers, skull tools, whatever technique you're comfortable with to end up with a plausible cloud shape. Save the blend file, important. Next, create a cube and scale it so that it contains the cloud mesh. Make it be a fluid domain. And make that cloud mesh be a fluid emitter. You can increase the voxel count, let the simulation run, add force fields, vorticity and whatnot to actually create a fluid simulation and build upon that base shape, right? And there should be a folder right where the blend file is saved. Look for the data subfolder and there's the VDB. Copy it somewhere safe, drag and drop it into UE's content folder, and that should open the Open VDB Import Options window. The point cloud data can then be remapped at will. I'm just interested in the density, so I'm gonna get rid of the rest to make the volume data as lightweight as possible. Next, press import to create a static sparse volume texture asset. Next, in the volumetric cloud material, create a sparse volume texture object and select the asset. Finally, add a sparse volume texture sample node and plug in the texture object. Provide UVW mapping coordinates and voila, that's the cloud density. A VDB sequence can even be imported to play an animation of some sort, kinda cool. That's bound to be very memory heavy though. Oh, and one more thing. As far as I know, this workflow likely expects a very detailed point cloud. This is not like a 3D distance field where you can work with a very low resolution 3D texture to remap the distance gradient at will. The VDB is expected to represent the actual final cloud density, so I feel like remapping the density is a bit more limited, but I could be wrong. Thus, you likely want to make this one VDB count, meaning reuse it as much as possible, because that asset weighs quite a lot in memory. But simply making that cloud tile doesn't look too great. So I'm going to show you one more cool trick. You can create a position lookup texture, meaning a texture that says, hey, you give me that position, here's another position for you. Let me show you a simple example. Here I take the 2D world position, initially expressed in centimeters, and I remap it to a much smaller range to project a 2D texture, right? So that's the U-axis, that's the V-axis from 0 to 1, 1 to 2, and so forth. Basic stuff. Like I explained earlier though, the GPU, by default, wraps mapping coordinates, so the value loops to stay in a 0 to 1 range. So, theoretically, if I create a texture that goes from 0 to 1 along that axis, in the red channel, and from 0 to 1 along that other axis in the green channel, and use it to get UVs from those UVs, well, that should result in the same exact thing. And it does. Just have to make sure to use a 16-bit texture for this, at least. 8 bits would likely suffer from precision issues. Although this technique suffers from one major drawback. Remember the pixel interpolation issue I mentioned a while back when sampling that 2D profile texture? Well, the very same thing happens here. For 2D world positions resulting in UVs close to 0 or 1 in either axis, due to wrapped coordinates, there's pixel interpolation happening around that region and that can mess up everything. You can end up with undesired UVs where interpolation happens. And there's no real way to fix this. It's just a quirk that comes with this technique. It may not even be visible at times. The issue usually appears on very thin lines where UVs are close to 0 or 1. You can, however, hide the artifact using a mask texture to ensure no density is visible around the troublesome areas. Anyway, this works, but it's kinda stupid, right? I have UVs that I feed into a texture to recreate the same exact UVs but with precision loss and extra issues. Why the hell would I do that? Well, I can create any UV map texture, like this one. That essentially creates 4 UV regions, translated, rotated and scaled, within that single 0 to 1 UV region, if that makes sense. Thus, the texture is mapped 4 times with said transforms applied. Notice the artifacts. That's where UVs are interpolated from any value superior to 0 back to 0, the background color. And this will need to be hidden with a mask of some sort, right? And that essentially is a position lookup texture, okay? You can make a cloud texture tile and make the most of it, and hide the tiling to some extent by using mirroring, rotation and scale in that position lookup texture. You can even deform coordinates. Here I used Blender to create and deform a bunch of planes. Just have to ensure that it tiles, and voila, super simple. I also output a mask generated from UVs to prevent artifacts, where interpolation happens with the background color, from being visible. It's what I mentioned just a minute ago, right? To conclude, here I create UVs from the X and Y world position. I feed that to the lookup texture to get new UVs. I append the missing W coordinate to create UVW coordinates to sample the VDB. And then I make sure the density is 0 where interpolation issues occur using the said mask. And using a position lookup texture to hide the tiling is not specific to VDBs, right? This is a trick that can be used with any texture, including 3D distance fields. And it's a technique I had kinda forgotten about, to be honest. It's only upon doing research on clouds for this video that I stumbled upon that cool article where the artist mentions using this trick. Shout out to him, link is in the video description below. Alright, Albedo. For most use cases it should be 1.0. Water droplets shouldn't, in theory, absorb light, just scatter it around. But that's assuming clouds do not contain dust or similar large light-absorbing particles. Nothing prevents you from making colored clouds though, especially when creating cool VFX and whatnot. There's however 2 reasons to lower the albedo. One is to put the emphasis on rain clouds. They are usually quite dark and increasing the density may not be enough to get that distinctive look. 2, that's to create what's now commonly called as the beer powder effect, I believe. This idea was first introduced in the Horizon paper, if I'm not mistaken, and it's a non-physically based approximation to create these black edges under certain lighting conditions. In this tech paper from Sebastian, he explains that he chose to go with a different approach. This powder effect isn't hard-coded in the volumetric shader, but can instead be somewhat recreated by the user using the albedo. Both methods have their pros and cons. So the idea is to remap the density to darken the albedo around the edges, meaning when the density reaches 0. And that's quite easily done, especially when using 3D distance fields, right? The distance driving the density can be remapped at will to create that dark halo. Now, that's quite an arbitrary solution, and it is my understanding that this phenomenon is a function of the density, and it looks like the best way to go about it is to use the density that you modulate to some extent and feed to an exponential function. You can then use the camera vector and light direction to mask that effect and re-implement what was explained in the Horizon paper. It's subtle and can lead to dirty-looking clouds if done too aggressively, but can enhance realism a little bit when done right. Here's another tip. The Cloud Sample Attributes node outputs the shadow sample distance, and that's true regardless of the shadow technique used, ray marched or shadow map. Meaning, if above 0, you know for sure the shader is sampling the clouds to generate shadows. Therefore, you can simply disable shadows, like so. Not very useful, of course, but you might want to go the other way around. Say, increase the density just when rendering shadows, why not? Shadows are always very expensive to render, so it's usually best practice to sample textures at a higher MIP level, and that's what I'm doing here. When rendering shadows, use a higher MIP level to sample textures, else use the MIP level 0. The difference might be barely perceptible, but that's precisely the point. Sampling lower MIPs helps with reducing the strain on GPU memory bandwidth, so if the difference can hardly be seen, go for it. Or best, do that based on distance, like so. Another thing to try is to skip sampling the erosion path when rendering shadows, both for optimization and to give shadows a softer look. That highly depends on how the erosion path is applied though. You might start to get shadows that do not make much sense anymore if the erosion path changes the cloud's shape too much, if that makes sense. Anyway, I'm sure there are other tricks regarding the shadow sample distance, so feel free to experiment with it. There's a lot to say about performance, and I already said quite a bit on the subject, but let's summarize. Let's begin with volumetric cloud material. This setting cost a bit of performance, but I haven't found it to be that impactful. Neither did that one. I didn't necessarily measure a noticeable difference between 0 and 2. Ground contribution, however, seems to be quite heavy. The grayscale material option is a very minor optimization that isn't really measurable. Next, ray march volume shadows is an expensive option, and the rest shouldn't affect performance at all. Besides the volumetric cloud material itself, of course. Keep it as simple as can be, avoid dependent texture fetches if possible, do as few texture samples as possible, leverage MIPs as best as you can, and reuse the same texture as much as possible as well. And obviously, master the conservative density mechanism. There's no point in having a conservative density that covers the whole sky if it's going to be remapped and eroded a ton afterwards. This is wasteful. Make sure to keep the conservative density as tight as possible so you only have to erode to create the details, and not the large-scale cloud shapes. Also, the softer the clouds, the less noise, usually. Next, let's have a look at the volumetric cloud actor. So on my end, this didn't result in a noticeable performance difference, but these obviously play quite a big role, especially if you use ray marched shadows. These can be important to tweak. If using the beer shadow map instead, the important settings lie in the directional light and they can have a tremendous impact on performance. Resolution and ray count play a big role, obviously. Oh, and the transmittance threshold can be important as well. And that's about it regarding the settings that are publicly exposed. If you want to dive deeper, there are tons of CVars you can play with. One is the volumetric render target. You should see a drastic quality improvement if you set it to 0. But you should also experience very bad performance. The reason for this is quite simple. Render targets can be used to do some computation at half the resolution or at quarter the resolution to speed things up drastically. and it can also allow clouds to be composited on top of translucent materials, if I'm not mistaken. And so setting this to 0 essentially means Ray match clouds at full resolution, and so the rendering cost becomes quite absurd. So let's set it back to 1 and let's check the volumetric render target mode CVar. By default, clouds are traced at quarter resolution and are reconstructed at half the resolution and then upsampled. But you can try different modes, they all are well explained. Another CVar you might want to check is the volumetric render target upsampling mode. I feel like no one particularly stands out though. They all have their pros and cons. Next, the volumetric cloud distance to sample max count can lead to a noticeable difference in the noise amount, so make sure to experiment with it. The volumetric cloud view ray sample max count can also be set to a higher value if you can afford it. And I think that's pretty much it. You can have the full list by just typing air.volumetric cloud or air.volumetric render target anyway. Use a question mark after a CVar to get its default value and tooltip. I'll let you investigate on your own. The gist of it is there's no magic setting. It's all a trade-off between performance and noise amount. Don't expect a complex volumetric cloud material to look amazing, super sharp and noiseless unless you crank up the settings, ray count and whatnot, but at that point, don't expect it to be free. That being said, a simple cloud material can look great and be very, very affordable if correctly set up. Alright, I'm briefly going to mention weather effects. This can be quite tricky to do right, and like most VFX, at least in UE, it most often involves using Niagara. This video is not a tutorial on Niagara though, so I won't go into too much detail. I'm just going to give you ideas and give you a glimpse of different effects you can experiment with. By the way, I've made a beginner to expert video on the Neighbor Grid 3D interface, which may help you get started with Niagara. Now, first of all, it's important to know that pretty much anything you do in a material graph can be replicated in a GPU Niagara system, meaning this conservative density, this graph, can be recreated in Niagara. See, this is that, and so on and so forth. Just have to replace the absolute world position node with the particle's world position. Make sure you use the same cloud layer settings, altitude and height, to rebuild the normalized altitude. And the rest can be recreated as is to compute the same exact density value at this world position. Which means you can spawn a bunch of particles in the air and kill any of them that are not in a dense enough cloud. Then make particles fall and you get rain. Cool. Keep in mind this is definitely not the recommended approach to create water droplets. You'd need to spawn an insane amount of particles in a very large area to get a dense enough rain when viewed from the ground. Rain is instead most often done locally around the camera for optimization purposes. And do I want to spend 3 months working on this video because I keep going off track? Sure I do, so let's take a side step and investigate some tricks you can use to create rain VFXs. First, to create localized rain, you could simply spawn particles randomly in a sphere or in a box positioned at the camera. That, however, usually results in quite a lot of wasted particles. Lots of particles that are not even visible, right? Like behind the camera, for instance. And so there's a method that I really like to more efficiently spawn particles. Spawning and updating particles isn't free after all, so might as well try to make the best of it. The idea is to generate a random screen position and use the camera view matrix to project particles to world space. It might sound fancy, but it's not that bad. So I'm going to create an empty emitter. Switch it to GPU, set the bounds mode to fixed, and set a crazy high value so I don't have to worry about the system being occluded. Next, let's add a spawn rate module. Then set the sprite size to, say, 1. Let's add an initial gravity force module, and it complains about the lack of a solve force module, so let's fix that. And maybe add an acceleration force module, so you may plug your wind force in here or something. Next, do the same upon particle update, gravity, solve force, and acceleration. Maybe even add a curl noise force module to add a bit of randomness to the picture, why not? Then let's add a scale size by speed module. Let's do 1, 1 and 110. Bring back the velocity to 500. And to make use of this effect, I'll want to enable velocity alignment in the sprite renderer. Finally, let's add a scale color module to tweak the alpha channel. Use a float from curve and fade particles in and out. Okay, cool. Now if I add a shape location module, I can see that the rain effect is working, somewhat. And that shape origin may then be the camera's position, so you can move around and it rains around you at all times. You may further tweak the sprite material and whatnot, but for the sake of this video, let's pretend this is good enough. Now, this way of spawning particles is fine, but again I feel like it results in a lot of wasted particles, so I want to try something. Let's get rid of that module and let's create a new scratchpad module. I want a camera query interface, and from that interface, I want the get clip space transform GPU node, and I'm interested in the screen to world transform matrix. The tooltip explains how it's meant to be used. To get a world position from this matrix, you multiply it with a vector 4, which contains the screen position in x and y, multiplied by the desired depth, the depth in z, and 1 in w. Okay, sounds straightforward enough. First, I want to generate a random UV. Let's make a local vector 2D and call it UVs. Make vector 2D, random float, max is 1.0, duplicate it, good. Next, get that randomized UV, and long story short, I need to convert it to screen coordinates, meaning UVs have to be in a -1 range. So let's do that. -0.5 and multiply by 2. Also, the y-axis needs to be flipped, don't worry about it. Next, multiply that vector 2D by the depth, that's what the tooltip says, right? Screen position multiplied by the scene depth. So let's add a float input called depth and multiply the screen position with it. I'm also going to create a float called Frustrum scale for reasons I'll explain in a second. Let's pretend this value is 1.0 for now and that it doesn't change anything to our equation. Alright, we are getting there. Let's make a vector 4, plug the x and y values, the z is the scene depth as described in the tooltip, and w must be 1.0. Finally, let's do the matrix multiplication, and the result is the particle world position. Just have to convert it to an actual position variable, like so. Alright, now let's try with a depth of 500. Particles are indeed spawned 500 centimeters in front of the camera. It's hard to visualize, particles may be too small to properly show in the video, but that's what's happening. Now, let's scale the Frustrum value down to, say, 0.3. See, it becomes quite apparent that this is a screen space effect. It's like a little box in the center of the screen. But it's important to understand this only drives the spawn position. Once spawned, particles are indeed in world space and do their own thing. If you look upward, particles are spawned in that little box in the center of the screen, but they do eventually fall in world space and end up covering the entire screen. Now, even with that Frustrum value set to 1.0, the screen space effect is quite apparent because of the alpha value fading in. Particles that are spawned right at the top of the screen need a little bit of time to become fully opaque, so you get to see some kind of edge fade, right? Akin to screen space reflections and whatnot. To fix this, simply increase the Frustrum value to some extent to quote-unquote expand the screen a little bit and spawn particles outside the actual camera Frustrum, and thus give particles time to fade in. Next, randomize the depth, and voila, a decent rain effect. And to create snow, you just need to tweak the gravity and curl noise forces really. Maybe add drag and whatnot. Rain and snow are really the same thing when it comes to VFXs. And if you compare with the previous method, when particles were spawned in a sphere all around the camera, with the same spawn rate, thus the same particle count, well, that resulted in fewer perceived particles. Again, because these particles were spawned way behind the camera, way to the left and to the right. Thus, with this Frustrum method, you get more bang for your buck. Also, what's cool about this effect is that the spawn location is in UV space at first. Which means this depth doesn't have to be randomized nor arbitrary. You can use the gbuffer interface to query the actual depth at the screen location and thus spawn particles directly onto opaque meshes. You may then even query the normal buffer to offset particles away from the surface a little bit and even kill particles if the z-normal doesn't meet a certain threshold. Next, get rid of the forces, and with a tiny bit of love, you can create a super cheap and decent rain splash effect. The main downside of this method is that the spawn logic happens in screen space, so the closer you get to a surface, the denser the effect gets. But arguably this shouldn't be too big of an issue, and there are ways to mitigate this side effect anyway. I also used a similar principle to pre-spawn lightning strikes, something I'll explain later on in the video. The gist of it is, rather than spawning particles randomly across the entire sky in the hope of ending in a storm cloud or something, I spawn them in a box. That box size is driven by the width of the Frustrum at an arbitrary depth. So it's like I pick a point here, pick a point there, do the world space projection I just explained with an arbitrary depth, and measure the distance between the resulting two world positions. That's the box size. The box location is simply the average of these two positions. The box is then rotated in 2D based on the camera forward vector. There's a bit of shenanigan to do in case you look upward and the forward vector ends up being an up vector, but that's not really important. Anyway, the box can then be pushed forward or backward a little bit in camera space, so that lightning strikes may still spawn at times behind the camera. Something I wanted. In Niagara, it translates to this. Pick a point to the left and to the right of the screen, do the projection with an arbitrary depth, get the distance between the resulting two world positions, also get the average for the center point. At that center point, create a random 2D box, which size is based on the distance between the 2 points in world space. Shift the box forward or backward, and rotate it in 2D based on the camera's forward vector. And the result is a 2D position in a 2D box based on the view Frustrum. The box is always facing the camera. It can be scaled up or down. And pushed forward or backward. And that proved to be a better solution to spawn lightning strikes when in a storm. Compared with a naive method where I spawn particles randomly in the entire sky with the same spawn rate, it increased the probability of lightning strikes being visible because spawned from position much more likely to be in view. So you see that the first method I described to spawn rain is quite a brute force and stupid technique. It's most often way better to spawn rain locally around the camera. The amount of rain is, however, still a function of the weather and the amount of rain clouds above you, right? And that information can at times be a bit of a challenge to get. You may consider using a Niagara particle system that spawns a single particle. On particle update, use your pawn's location, provided via blueprint. and convert that world position to UVs to sample the rain amount from a weather texture or even the volumetric cloud material that you'd recreate in that emitter. Then send that value back to the blueprint using the callback handler interface. And based on the value received, drive the spawn rate of the local rain particle effect. It's a bit complex, but I'll have another chance at explaining this in more detail later on in the video. Anyway, using some kind of local effect is probably a better solution than spawning droplets randomly across the entire sky, hoping for some to end up in clouds. Still, you can rely on this brute force technique to create weather effects at a large scale. Lightning strikes, distant rain and whatnot. I feel like it becomes a viable solution when you don't need a high particle density. So here's an example. Here I spawn some amount of particles per second, not that much. The particle's lifetime is set to a fixed amount, and the particle's width is randomized. Particles are spawned in a huge flat box positioned high in the sky. At that position, I sample the cloud density from the recreated volumetric cloud material. If the density sampled does not meet a certain threshold, kill the particle. Next, the particle's height is simply based on its position in the sky, so that it's stretched from the clouds to the ground, if that makes sense. The particle's color is set to drive the opacity based on the rain amount at that location, and the sprite alignment is set to an up vector. Thus, the sprite renderer is configured to use this custom alignment vector. The particle's pivot is also offset in Z. And I forgot to do that, but make sure to set the sort precision to high for this effect to avoid flickering. Next, a simple translucent material is used to mimic some kind of cheap fog and thus create distant rain. Now, it can be a challenge to have that material react to lightning the same way the volumetric cloud material does, something to keep in mind, but it's doable. And I'll mention some techniques I experimented with in just a minute. Creating distant rain is an interesting challenge and there are many things to try. Here's another possible solution. Disclaimer, it comes with a few gotchas and I'm not entirely confident it's the best idea performance-wise, but who knows, it may work for you. My thinking was the following. A cloud is made of water droplets, and rain is made of water droplets. It's just a continuity of the cloud, if that makes sense. So why not use the volumetric cloud material to render rain as well? The idea is to create two layers in the volumetric clouds, a rain layer and the cloud layer on top. Thus, the cloud layer bottom altitude has to first be set to 0 for rain to reach the ground, right? And its height may be increased by how much it was offset in Z for the cloud layer to reach the same top altitude as before. In the cloud material, the normalized altitude then likely needs to be remapped to account for that extra rain layer, right? To push clouds back up in the sky, since 0 no longer corresponds to the cloud bottom altitude, but to the ground. Let's compare before and after that tweak and ensure clouds look the same. And it looks indeed similar. Great, we didn't break anything. However, clouds were initially noticeably darker. That's before and after. And that's simply the result of the default ambient occlusion, which is a function of the normalized altitude. It's a naive top-down gradient. Thus, since 0 no longer corresponds to the cloud bottom altitude but to the ground, the amount of AO applied on clouds, now much higher in the cloud media, is noticeably more subtle. Not that huge of a deal, and we could likely fix this anyway by providing the material our own AO term. I'm not going to do that here because I don't care. Now, to create the rain density, there are multiple solutions. It depends on how the rain clouds are authored in the first place. Let's assume rain falls as long as there's at least some cloud density at a certain altitude. In other words, I want to sample the volumetric cloud material at a certain Z location, the altitude where rain starts to fall, right? And assuming I created the rain clouds with this single 3D texture sample, it comes down to sampling that same texture with a fixed W coordinate. And thus, that results in a top-down extrusion across the entire cloud media, like explained earlier. Use the normalized altitude to create a vertical mask and hide this density above the rain layer. Next, combine this with the cloud layer, also masked in Z so it doesn't show in the rain layer, and voila. Now, you might want to erode clouds, right? And applying any treatment to this conservative density is going to modify both clouds and rain. And that's where the conservative density extra channels may come handy. In the red channel, that's the conservative density, the total amount of density in the cloud media. And in the green and blue channels, I can send the rain density and cloud density separately to reconstruct the total density however I please. Say I get the cloud density, apply erosion, and then add the rain density afterwards. Thus, the red channel is not even used anymore. Well, it is still used internally by the shader to drive the dynamic branch, to know if it has to evaluate the full shader, right? Therefore, the red channel always has to contain the maximum density. But that density may be built from multiple layers that you can send individually in the extra channels to reconstruct the final density however you please with greater control. Rain can also be controlled using cloud masks to ensure it only falls from certain cloud types and so on and so forth. Ideally, you're working with a 2D weather map of some kind that simply tells where rain falls, like explained in the Horizon paper. You can also override the W component of the UVW coordinates using the normalized altitude to switch to a fixed value and thus stretch this 3D texture in Z to create the rain layer. This saves the texture sample but can be a tiny bit more constraining to work with. Again, creating the rain density really depends on the way you create clouds in the first place. Possibilities are endless and you can do things in a million different ways. Speaking of possibilities, I investigated another solution. Including the rain layer in the volumetric cloud material is fine, but it comes with a few downsides. It obviously makes the whole shader a bit more expensive, but it also goes against some optimization tricks used internally. For instance, that distance mode now becomes irrelevant because the cloud media now starts at 0 and thus the camera is always inside it. Therefore, each ray starts at the camera and has to march quite a few steps to reach the actual cloud layer. And that's bound to have an impact on performance or quality in some way or another. So I wanted to try something else. I'm only very briefly going to mention this because it is as sketchy as possible and it didn't meet my expectations, but I thought the idea was kinda cool. My intuition was that distant rain would likely have a color nearly identical to the cloud's bottom layer. It would look like a top-down extrusion of the cloud bottom color, if that makes any sense. Thus, that's exactly what I attempted. My goal was to somehow sample the scene color underneath each rain cloud and extrude that color downward. So in Niagara, I created a half-res buffer. Using a simulation stage, I iterate over each pixel in that buffer. Thus, for each pixel, I compute its UV from the grid unit index. UV converted to screen coordinates and then to world space based on the camera screen to world transform matrix, and then to a unit direction in world space based on the camera's position. The resulting unit vector is similar to the camera vector node in a material graph. I'm pretty sure that's not the cheapest way to build it in Niagara, but whatever. Having the camera vector and camera position, I can trace a ray and march along it to accumulate data. At each step, I sample the depth buffer to make sure I don't march past obstacles. I then get the sample's 2D location and convert it to UVs to sample the weather map and see if rain falls at that world location. If so, I get that 2D location and append a Z location that roughly equals the cloud layer bottom altitude, the altitude where rain starts falling. That world position is converted from world to clip space and then to UVs to sample the scene color. Thus, it's like at each step, I look above to sample the cloud's bottom color in screen space. The darkest perceived color is retrieved, and accumulated over time with the most basic temporal accumulation algorithm ever to smooth out the jitter I add to the samples to get rid of bonding and noise. That color is output to a render target. Render target put on screen using a triangle that is displayed right in front of the camera thanks to a vertex shader, and that's pretty much it. The scene color underneath rain clouds is extruded downward, and that gives this interesting look. Now, as cool as it sounds, this technique is infinitely sketchy. It has a measurable cost and comes with all the downsides of screen space effects, meaning when the necessary data is not in view anymore, the effect breaks down. And at that point, it's either the wrong color is extruded, or you do a depth test to reject invalid samples. So yeah, not really a viable solution to create distant rain, but I thought it was cool enough to mention it. And that actually sparked another idea in my mind, one that relies on a similar principle but with fewer downsides. The idea is to still sample the scene color, but cache each sample so that it may persist regardless of upcoming occlusion. And for that, particles to the rescue. So first I spawn particles all around the camera. For each card, I compute a number of world positions along its top edge to account for the card's width. Next, I convert each position from world to clip space, and then to UVs to sample the scene color. For each card, the darkest perceived color is retrieved and used to colorize that card with the cheapest unlit translucent material ever. Do some shenanigan to fade them in and out based on the cloud sample validity, and that results in a similar effect to the ray-marched scene color extrusion method I just explained, but with fewer downsides. It is much cheaper and is much more stable. The screen space cloud color data still needs to be in view for rain cards to be spawned and faded in, but as long as that data was in view at least once, cards can keep that color in memory and thus remain visible regardless of any upcoming occlusion. Cool. This is, however, still a cheap hack and falls short in a lot of cases. It doesn't look good at all up close, so it's limited to distant rain. And that's okay as long as the rain clouds are in the distance, but not so much when they are also above you, right? You get to see this effect disappearing up close. The chance of getting a scene color sample from the clouds directly above the player is very low anyway. You rarely look straight up, so the effect has to be restricted to distant rain. Lightning strikes may also completely break this effect for various reasons, so I'm still not satisfied with this method. It seems like including the rain in the volumetric cloud material is the only solid solution, but it also suffers from a lot of drawbacks in my opinion, so this is still an open problem. To stay on the topic of rain, you can make the ground wet where it is raining. Moreover, you can add an evaporation mechanism to keep the ground wet for a while. In a nutshell, the idea is to render the conservative density into a render target using an additive method and every tick fade it out a little bit. That's at least one way of doing it, so let's check it out. This is the same simple distant rain emitter I previously demonstrated, but with extra features. For the most part, it still simply spawns particles in a volume. Upon particle spawn, the conservative density from the volumetric cloud material is recreated and sampled to kill any particle that is not in a dense enough cloud. Same thing as before. But now I also rely on a couple of simulation stages to do extra things on top of that. Here I create and set up a 2D grid interface and a 2D render target. Both are configured to have the same size. Using a simulation stage, I iterate each grid cell to initialize a value I called Wetness to 0. And this is done only when the simulation is reset, very important. In a second simulation stage, I iterate each grid cell again to build upon that Wetness value, meaning whatever value it currently has, 0 at first, is decreased over time to create the evaporation mechanism. And then I increase it when and where it is raining. and let's assume it is simply raining where there are clouds. So I sample the conservative cloud density, just like here during particle spawn, to know where clouds are and thus where rain falls. However, there's a subtle but important difference. In the volumetric cloud material, the conservative density is sampled and built using the absolute world position. Makes sense, right? And in that Niagara system, in the particle stage, I explained that the same density could be built and sampled using the particle's world position. However, there's no position data to use in a simulation stage, so you have to somehow build it, and when iterating a 2D grid, one way is to use the exec to unit index function. Assuming the 2D grid has the same size as the render target, this basically outputs the render target UVs. Thus, if you want to stretch that wetness map over, say, 10 km, that 0 to 1 UV range maps to 0 to 10 km. So it has to be multiplied by 1 million. However, first, UVs have to be shifted by 0.5, so that 0.5 in the U and V axis, the center point of that render target, becomes 0 to quote-unquote center the render target. And assuming you want that wetness map centered on 0, 0, 0, the world origin, that's all you have to do to recreate the X and Y world position from UVs. The Z coordinate may then be arbitrary and equal the cloud's bottom altitude, the altitude it's raining from, if that makes sense. From that Z coordinate and the provided cloud layer bottom altitude and height settings, the normalized altitude can thus be recreated. That way, I can rebuild the volumetric cloud material in the simulation stage and thus sample a single horizontal slice of the volumetric clouds and feed the output to that module to increase the wetness value with it. Finally, write the wetness grid attribute into a render target and done. There's one gotcha to keep in mind though: wind. Wind may displace water droplets enough that the ground may be wet, although there's no clouds above. So this offset may need to be calculated to offset the reconstructed world position here in one way or another, to account for the wind when rendering the wetness map, something I didn't do. Now this method of rendering a wetness map is a bit involved and it doesn't have to be that way. Again, I'm showcasing different solutions. Most often, the cloudscape is dynamically generated from a 2D weather map of some kind, and you're ideally working with a channel that controls rain, like demonstrated in the Horizon paper. The cloud coverage in the volumetric cloud material is usually a function of that texture channel, so you know there are clouds where there is rain, if that makes sense. Thus, to render the wetness map, you don't need to sample a slice of the volumetric clouds and recreate the entire material in Niagara, since you already know where rain occurs. You really just need to sample that rain channel from that weather texture, and then you do the additive and subtractive steps to add and evaporate water over time and you're done. The resulting wetness map can then be sampled in a landscape material to, say, drive a height lerp to increase the roughness, darken the albedo, and tweak the normal to apply a cheap ripple effect. You do you. The sky's the limit and the devil lies in the details. These effects are not necessarily super hard to create and not too complicated to get working on an individual basis. However, to unify the look of everything, atmosphere, clouds, wind, rain, both up close and far away, is very, very difficult and time-consuming. Only once you give it a solid try can you really appreciate when it is well done in games. Red Dead Redemption 2 being the most brilliant example that comes to my mind. Brilliant work. Also, massive shout out to the OG Horizon and Andrew Schneider for its truly inspiring work. With this video, I merely want to point out different existing solutions to create clouds and weather effects, up to you to master them to reach this level of quality. Good luck, it's difficult. Also, keep in mind, any techniques used to create rain can be used to create snow. Same but different. Still on the topic of weather effects, you may want to create lightning strikes. And this is no different than spawning rain in clouds. spawn a bunch of particles in the cloud layer and kill them if not in a dense enough cloud. Make these particles huge. Offset the pivot. Set the sprite alignment to an up vector. Scale the alpha over time. Sample some kind of lightning strike texture, and that would be a starting point. There are of course many ways to go about this. The fun part is to make them emit light, and you'd be tempted to use a point light renderer, but sadly these are only available when using CPU emitters. And because texture samplers are required to sample the conservative cloud density, a CPU emitter is not a solution here. Well, I mean, Niagara is insanely powerful and you could use advanced tricks to bypass this limitation, but that's clearly out of the scope of this video. So the simplest alternative solution is to render these particles into a render target. I'll skip the details though, because again this is not a tutorial nor a Niagara focused video, but the idea is to set up a grid 2D interface and loop through all particles for each grid cell. Then for each particle compare how distant it is to the grid cell to create a radial gradient. Accumulate that value and that's it. I'll let you pause the video to take a look at the code. And this results in a 2D light texture. Sample that texture in the volumetric cloud material and plug that into the emissive pin. And ta-da! Now, if you remember, earlier in the video I explained that using 2D coordinates to sample a 2D texture in a volumetric material is like extruding that texture in Z. So this light texture is essentially extruded from top to bottom through the entire cloud layer. However, by now you should know how to derive data for the Z-axis, right? You can of course mask that texture in Z using the normalized altitude, like say make it visible only high enough in the cloud layer. Thus the light now shows through the clouds when seen from underneath, kinda cool. And you can go even further, like say spawn even more lightning particles, but randomize the particles visibility tag. See, this renderer draws all particles that have a visibility value of 0. So if 1 particles are invisible, but are still drawn into this render target. And that essentially creates invisible lightning strikes, giving the impression that something nasty is happening high above the clouds. Now, instead of using a render target to draw the actual light resulting from these lightning strikes, you could use a tiny texture where you encode each active lightning strike position and intensity in a pixel. My implementation is sadly a bit complicated, because the challenge is that the render target has a limited size, say 4 pixels to encode 4 active lightning strikes at a time. And this emitter might have 5 or 10 lightning strikes active at a given frame, who knows. Thus, picking just 4 particles in that emitter and outputting their positions to a render target in a way that is consistent from frame to frame is complicated. So I had to come up with a weird way involving 2 emitters, both with persistent IDs enabled. This second emitter spawns as many particles as pixels in the render target, in my case 4. They are spawned just once and never die. Now each particle contains a Niagara ID. At first it's null, so checking if that ID points to a valid ID in that other emitter results in an invalid query. Thus I get a Niagara ID from a randomly picked lightning strike particle in that emitter, and at that point that ID stored in this particle points to an existing particle in that other emitter. I'm not sure if that makes sense. Anyway, in a simulation stage I iterate each render target pixel. I use a second attribute reader to read from self, this time, this emitter, to get the ID I stored in each particle. And I use it to query the lightning strike particle in the other emitter. Yeah, I told you it was complicated. Probably unnecessarily so. I don't know, I couldn't figure out a simpler solution that is stable from frame to frame. but it works and seems to give a stable result regardless of the amount of active lightning strikes. Of course, only up to 4 of them can actually emit light at a given time, to keep the effect somewhat cheap to compute in the volumetric cloud shader. Speaking of, in the volumetric cloud material, I sample that texture, loop through all its pixels, and do a distance check against each lightning strike position to compute the light attenuation in 3D, and thus recreate the light emanating from each active lightning strike with per pixel accuracy. Whereas, with the 2D light texture, the light intensity and attenuation was baked in the texture and had limited precision. Both techniques have their pros and cons. Instead of using a single sprite, you could use ribbons to render these lightning strikes. This is a bit more involved though. I've recently made a video where I explained in detail how to use ribbons, so you might want to give it a look. As explained in that video, spawning a ribbon is done by spawning several particles all at once. I could try to spawn a bunch of particles to create a ribbon and immediately kill them all if the strike happens to be outside a dense cloud. That's what I was doing with that simple lightning strike particle system, remember? That rejection method. And I was fine with that simple technique because these lightning strikes were made of a single particle. I was essentially spawning and killing a few particles here and there, not that big of a deal. Here, using ribbons, each lightning strike is made of potentially many particles, and so I didn't like that idea anymore. It seemed wasteful. Ideally, I would still do that rejection method just once per ribbon, not once per particle making up that ribbon, if that makes sense. But particles making up a ribbon are spawned on emitter update, and that stack runs on the CPU, even when using a GPU emitter. Thus, I can't sample the conservative density in that stack because of the texture samplers, requiring using a GPU emitter. Thus, it seems I'm constrained to do that rejection method at the particle level. Not great. And similarly, I can't just say, hey, spawn a ribbon inside a cloud right away. That knowledge, that location, doesn't exist. All I have is a 3D density that can be sampled at a given location. It's not like I have a list of positions inside dense clouds that I can pick from. Well, actually, I kinda do. These particles that are known to be inside clouds, because of this rejection method, can very well act as a list of positions for another emitter. So let's not render these at all anymore. Using a second emitter and an attribute reader to read particle data from that emitter, I can spawn a bunch of particles, thus spawn ribbons, at randomized time intervals. Upon particle spawn, I may then query this emitter using an attribute reader to read the position of a particle that survived the cloud density rejection method. And that boils down to picking an index that is in the range of that emitter's particle count, if that makes sense. Since particle indexes are not persistent from frame to frame, picking any valid index essentially results in picking a random particle. And the position I read with the attribute reader can thus serve as a location to spawn the ribbon, the start point. Then I somehow have to find the hit point, the target point, and I may use the landscape interface to sample the landscape under that location or something. Plenty of solutions here. For now, I'll just use the same position in X and Y and 0 in Z, the ground level. Oh, and the start location can also be randomized a bit, just in case two ribbons somehow randomly selected the same particle from that other emitter as a spawn location to make sure they don't perfectly overlap if that happens, if that makes sense. See, that curl noise force module doesn't have any effect on the particles. It's just here to compute and output a noise signal I can use at will. Particles making up this ribbon can then be quote-unquote distributed in between the start and target locations using their normalized index to actually create the ribbon. And the loop count can be used as a ribbon ID. Extra noise can also be used to deform the middle part of the ribbon and create stylized lighting strikes and whatnot. Super cool. Now, using a single sprite to render a lightning texture is much more efficient, simpler, and allows for more artistic control. However, this ribbon method allows you to do something really cool. Remember, I was rendering these lightning particles into a 2D light texture, right? Texture that was sampled in the volumetric cloud and arbitrarily mapped in Z using the normalized altitude. However, now, because the ribbon is made of several particles, I can render each particle into a 3D texture. That'd be like spawning point lights at regular intervals along the lightning strike. And because the ribbon allows me to have a 0 to 1 value along its length, I can drive this point light's intensity along the lightning strike and create a very precise 3D light texture. And the method is almost identical to the render target solution I briefly explained earlier. Just that instead of a 2D grid, you use a 3D grid, and instead of a render target, you use a volume render target. The underlying principle remains the same. Loop over all particles for each grid cell, get the distance from the particle to the cell, compute the light attenuation and accumulate it, and that's it. You end up with a 3D light texture that you can sample as is in your volumetric cloud material. Just have to ensure the mapping coordinates corresponds to the one used to initially convert the particle's world positions to UVW coordinates, if that makes sense. This technique can definitely be expensive though. Now that wouldn't necessarily be super useful in this case, because the Z dimension is kinda limited here. But say you're making a game and a level happens to be in the cloud layer and lightning strikes happen all over the place. You can make these lightning strikes inject 3D light data into the volumetric clouds shader. Really cool. Sadly, because clouds are very expensive to render, temporal effects are heavily used to distribute the workload over many frames. In other words, the final cloud render is accumulated over several frames, right? And a lightning strike is a very short on and off effect, so it doesn't play too well with temporal accumulation. There are console variables, both regarding the volumetric clouds and temporal effects. You can likely tweak to fix some of these visual artifacts in case you need to create such effects. Anyway, here's one more method to create lightning strikes: meshes. Forget the complicated ribbon setup, let's get back to using an emitter that simply spawns a few particles here and there, and let's kill them if they do not meet a certain criteria, like say, sample a high enough value from a weather map or rain map or something, you do you. But this time let's use a mesh renderer. The mesh is created in Blender. I used a curve to draw a lightning strike. I also created some branches, why not? Next, I used a simple line as a curve profile to create a super thin geometry. It has to be that way because the actual thickness comes from a vertex shader. I'll explain why in a second. Next, convert that curve to a mesh and let's use the first UV map to create what I may call the animation UV. This main branch is pretty straightforward. From left to right, from top to bottom. Each branch, however, is shifted vertically to match where they are connected to the main branch, if that makes any sense. See? They are also arbitrarily scaled down vertically. Rinse and repeat for all branches, and you end up with a UV map that you can use to create a gradient that you scroll along to generate the animation. See? I also used a second UV map to control the thickness shader. From top to bottom, that's the root to tip thickness gradient, like say thicker in clouds and thinner at the ground. And from left to right, that's a second gradient to further add some randomness to the thickness. Notice the horizontal spikes where branches are connected. I just wanted to emphasize hotspots around branches and have a thicker mesh there. And that's pretty much it for the mesh. In a material, I used a spline thicken node to create the thickness. But it doesn't just create thickness, it does it in a way that makes the mesh face the camera at all times, just like a ribbon. Now you may need to turn on two-sided in case it faces the wrong way, or flip the mesh UVs along the U-axis to flip the geometry around. Note that the UV map 0 is used by default for the projection, so that's the channel you have to mirror to flip the geometry. Next, let's add a bilinear gradient to fade out the edges. And next, the animation. Assuming the animation time goes from 0 to 1, you can see the lightning strike expanding and doing its thing, right? Here I sped up the animation time so that it reaches 1 way quicker, if that makes sense. And when above 1 from the remainder of the animation, I switch to a pulsing effect, a much brighter one. And that results in that bright flash when the lightning strike actually connects with the ground. Cool. Final step, replace this arbitrary time with a particle age and voila. But I'm not done. Buckle up. Let's get rid of the mesh renderer. These particles are not rendered anymore but still exist, right? Meaning they are spawned and live for a little while, assuming they survived the rejection step, okay? So just like with the ribbon method, this emitter can act as a list of positions to spawn lightning strikes from. But this time let's do it on the CPU. Here I created an object user parameter. In a blueprint, with this Niagara emitter attached to it, upon begin play, I forward self, this blueprint, to that emitter. Next, I implemented the Niagara Readback interface to implement the only method provided by that interface. An important step, I cache the data received. Finally, in the Niagara emitter, I just added this module here. That boolean must be true, and the user parameter object, the blueprint reference I set well in blueprint, has to be set here. Next, I set the size to 1 and send the particle's position. That means each frame, this blueprint will get the position of the first GPU particle in that emitter because of that limit. And since particle indexes are by default non-persistent from frame to frame, the position received is going to be random. But we, at least, know it's in a dense enough cloud because it comes from a particle that survived the rejection method, right? Which means you may spawn a blueprint at that location whenever you desire, say every 2 seconds using a timer. A blueprint that owns the lightning strike mesh, plus a non-shadow casting point light so the lightning strike actually emits light, why not? And who knows what more. You may then spawn a sound upon begin play where the lightning strike happens, and thus that sound can be spatialized, occluded, and all the good things. The sky's the limit here. You'll have to change the material logic for the animation time, but the fix is easy. You may, for instance, use primitive data to send a timestamp to the material when you want the animation to start, and thus, in the material, compute the time elapsed since then to create the animation time. Cool. Now, spawning lightning strikes come with an interesting challenge I haven't mentioned yet. Figuring out the Z position. Assuming I'm spawning particles in the entire sky and sampling a storm texture or a weather map of some kind to kill particles that are not in a storm, well, that only gives me a 2D location in the sky, right? I don't really know where the quote-unquote storm cloud is in Z. It depends on the way this information is computed in the volumetric cloud material in the first place. And so I guess the simplest solution would be to assume such a cloud is that high in the sky and that thick and that's it. You can thus hardcode the lightning strike Z position and be pretty sure that it ends up in the storm cloud. However, in case an artist-driven cloud profile lookup texture is used, like explained earlier, figuring out the Z position may not be as easy as assuming lightning strikes happen at a fixed altitude. It could vary based on that lookup texture, right? And so I tried something that I thought was worth mentioning. First, I split the vertical profile curve into 2 curves. A top profile and a bottom profile because I was strictly interested in the bottom profile to solve this issue. My goal was to figure out how low I could spawn lightning strikes so that they still end up in storm clouds. In other words, scan the bottom profile texture to somehow find this area. I ended up doing what's called a binary search, I believe. I'm not sure that's the best solution for this particular problem, but it worked. The idea is very simple. I sample the bottom profile texture right in the middle. If the value sampled is, say, not 0, then I'm above where the storm cloud layer begins in Z, if that makes sense. So I take a second sample to the left. Else, if the value sampled is close to 0, then I'm likely below the cloud layer, so I take a second sample to the right. And each time I sample the curve in the middle of the remaining range. Do that in a loop and with very few iterations that get me close enough to the normalized altitude I'm looking for, where the storm cloud layer begins in Z. Thus, knowing the volumetric cloud layer height and bottom layer altitude in kilometers, I can derive from this value the absolute Z position to spawn lightning strikes at. And that's pretty much it. In HLSL it translates to this. And since it's done just once upon particle spawn, and that the lookup texture is ideally tiny, this shouldn't be too costly. But again, that's not the solution I ended up using. I simply ended up hardcoding an altitude and thickness for the storm cloud layer, both in the volumetric cloud material and lightning strike particle effect. Much simpler. But again, I thought this technique was worth mentioning. A quick word about post-process effects. There's obviously a lot you can do here, so I'll be brief and stick to a quick breakdown of a simple rain effect on the camera lens. Here's the material function to create analytical water droplets. I start with the screen UVs ever so slightly offset in the v-axis, with time, to make droplets slide down on the camera lens. I also add a bit of noise from a curl noise texture to distort UVs and not end up with perfectly round droplets. The distorted UVs are then multiplied and I get the fractional part of each component to create a number of, let's say, grid cells. The multiplied UVs are also sent to a super cheap cell noise function to generate a random RGB value per grid cell, so you can randomize some logic and whatnot per droplet, like offset UVs randomly in each cell. Next, I do a constant bias scale to shift UVs on the center of each cell, and that allows me to derive both the direction and distance to the droplet's center. The distance needs to be multiplied because of that random UV offset. If the droplet is, say, shifted in the U-axis within its grid cell, well, then it's closer to that grid cell edge, so you have a little bit less room to work with, to generate a sphere mask and whatnot, else it would clip, if that makes sense. So that's what I do here in a random manner using one of the cell noise channels. I then saturate and do a 1- to get the distance from the droplet center. I do some further math to create a bilinear gradient. 0 in the center, 1 near the edge, and 0 at the edge. For the animation part, time is simply randomly offset per cell using one of the cell noises channels. I get the fractional part to get a looping animation, scaled by some arbitrary amount to create an abrupt fade in and smooth fade out, like so. The animation is also simply culled based on the cell noise's blue channel, to simply enable or disable some of the droplets based on the rain intensity, what I call the threshold. Alright, the idea is then to sample the scene texture with UVs distorted by this 2D vector, modulated by the bilinear sphere mask and overall cell opacity resulting from that animation logic. And that's what I do here. I create 2 water droplets layers. The direction is modulated with the opacity and bilinear sphere mask, just like I said. And I combine both layers to generate a 2D offset to add to the UVs used to sample the scene texture. It may be hard to see in the video, but you may get to see some of the water droplets in those UVs. And that's the gist of it. If you're fancy, you can also add a little bit of shadow. Here I get the direction to the center, isolate the vertical component, and modulate it with the droplet's opacity and bilinear sphere mask to get some kind of fake shadow in the lower hemisphere of each droplet. and if you're super fancy, you can add Occlusion, meaning disable this post-process effect when inside buildings and whatnot. I used a scene capture component to render the depth from a top-down orthographic point of view. Knowing the scene capture's Z location, the rendered depth can be converted to an actual absolute Z position. The resulting texture may not make much sense visually because this texture stores Z values in centimeters, thus it must at least be 16 bits. Anyway, sample the Z position stored in that texture at the camera's position, and if the camera's Z position is smaller than the value sampled, you're in a dry spot and you can turn off this post-process effect. You could also, of course, do a simple vertical line trace in Blueprint from your character's position to check if there's a roof above and disable this post-process material entirely. Much simpler and likely cheaper, but you may not be able to use a line trace for all effects, like say for rain particles, right? Fortunately, applying the occlusion effect to particles is equally simple. Use the particle's world position to sample the Z texture, and if the particle's Z position is below the value sampled from that texture, then mask it. A better solution, I believe, would be to do that upon particle spawn in the Niagara Rain system. Much cheaper. Now, that Z position map or height map can be baked using custom tools, like this blueprint, but you can also generate it dynamically using runtime virtual textures. First, make sure virtual textures are enabled in your project settings. Next, create a runtime virtual texture and set the content to world height. Add a runtime virtual texture volume to your scene, set the runtime virtual texture, and move and scale the actor so both the occluder and occluded objects are contained within the volume. Configure the occluder mesh so that it's rendered in the runtime virtual texture, and make sure the material it uses outputs the world Z height to virtual textures. Finally, in the ground or landscape material, sample that height virtual texture and do a Z-test and voila. The edges are super harsh and to be honest I'm not entirely sure what's the best way to blur them. Sampling this runtime virtual texture multiple times with jittered position comes to mind, but considering these cost twice as much as a regular texture sample, I'm not too sure that's the best idea performance-wise, especially because landscape materials are usually quite expensive to begin with. Let me know in the comments if you have any idea. Anyway, to conclude on post-process effects, it's always a good idea to turn off effects when they are not needed. There's no need to render water droplets on the camera lens when it's not raining, right? Now, when I spoke on rain effects, I mentioned using Niagara to sample the weather map at a specific location and sending that information back to a blueprint using a readback event to see if rain falls near your pond's location or something. Well, that technique can be used to simply create a switch for the post-processed material. See if rain is currently falling and see if it was like that the last frame, and thus enable or disable the post-processed material accordingly. Alright, before moving on to more technical stuff and breaking down several blueprint tools I built and some other things, I want to spend a bit of time explaining the weather system I ended up creating. I'll be somewhat brief because it essentially relies on most, if not all, the techniques I explained so far, but with some subtle differences. As usual, the devil lies in the details, and you can do things in a million different ways. And truth be told, I'm not entirely satisfied with the end result, so I'll give you pointers to how I built mine and let you come up with your own. Anyway, it all starts with two simple render targets. They both are mapped across the entire sky and cover an area that roughly equals 30 km squared. The first texture contains a cloud coverage of 4 cloud types, one type per channel. and the second texture encodes the amount of potential precipitation and electricity in the air. Emphasis on potential. There still needs to be clouds at that location for rain to actually fall and lightning to strike. And I assumed the cloud type stored in the red channel would be the only cloud type that may create rain if the precipitation value is non-zero, and that may spawn lightning strikes if the electricity value is non-zero as well, for simplicity's sake. 4 cloud types means 4 cloud layers. Each cloud layer altitude and thickness is hard-coded. That means I can also hard-code the rain and lightning strikes VFX's Z position to match the altitude of the cloud layer spawning these effects. Now, the way these two render targets are drawn is nothing too complex. Essentially, I rely again on this 3D Perlin Worley Noise texture. Using a remapping function, I can expand or contract this noise and change its black and white levels. Next, using a simple spherical gradient from the render target's center point, which likely corresponds to where the player roughly is, assuming this weather map is centered on the world origin, I can control the way this noise is remapped based on distance. Essentially, that means I have a set of remapping controls for clouds up close and far away. That way I can, say, create a clear sky up close and lots of clouds in the horizon. I also have control over the 3D noise texture scale and control over the W coordinate used to sample that 3D noise texture. That means I can scroll the 3D noise texture in the vertical axis and sample a specific slice to add some randomness when changing weather and whatnot. And neat trick, to get rid of the obvious tiling pattern, I use the distance to the center to offset that W coordinate by some amount. This results in a visible circular pattern, because the 3D noise texture is scrolled in Z with the distance to the center, but it's not that obvious when seen from the ground, and it definitely helps get rid of visible tiling. The wind offset is also applied to, well, offset the 3D noise texture in X and Y and add motion to the cloudscape. Oh, and I also sample a second noise texture, which is also remapped in a user-controllable way to further mask this first 3D noise and create randomness at a much broader scale across the entire weather map. And that results in a complex noise pattern, a coverage signal for a specific cloud type. Repeat that 4 times, once per cloud type, thus once per channel. Although that's not the entire story. Everything I just explained is done twice. Once for the current quote-unquote weather, and once more for the next weather coming ahead. You see, weather is controlled using data assets. These expose settings to control the various noise remap functions I just explained, and that for each cloud type, but also for the precipitation and electricity signals. And my weather system allows you to blend between 2 data assets and thus change the weather, right? See, when this set function is called, I cache the current weather and the weather to follow, and I provide the material responsible for rendering these noise patterns the necessary data, all the remapping values and whatnot. It's a bit tedious to do in blueprints, and it has a cost due to the number of nodes required, but convert that to C++ and the cost should be negligible. Then, once configured, these 2 materials are drawn into 2 render targets. I skipped one important step though. You see, at this point, the material can output 2 different noise patterns across the sky for 2 different weather states. So which one does it render? Well, both. Both are lerped using a 3rd render target, the blend render target. This is to allow for the weather state to be changed spatially. And this is simply rendered with a math function to scroll a linear gradient along a certain direction, like say the current wind direction, or generate an expanding spherical mask and whatnot. It's nothing too crazy, and it results in this super low resolution black and white texture that tells when the weather transitions from its current state to the next state, meaning lerp the 3D noise texture remapped in 2 different ways. And for the most part, that's pretty much it. The volumetric cloud material samples these 2 render targets. For each cloud type, I create a cloud layer using a triangle function, to in turn create the cloud vertical profile. The conservative density is built from all these layers, plus the rain and storm cell layers, which are also sent individually in extra channels for later reconstruction. The rain layer is built from the coverage signal of the cloud type responsible for precipitations, the cloud layer A, the one stored in the red channel like I explained earlier. And since this is a 2D texture, it's extruded in Z across the entire cloud media because of the ray marching, and thus it has to be masked in Z using the normalized altitude like I explained before. It's also masked based on distance to the camera, personal preference. Regarding the storm cell, more on that in a minute. Having the conservative density, next I sample a 3D texture. And its channels are used to erode each cloud type. The idea here is to try and come up with distinctive looking cloud layers, and I was not good at this. This could be improved a lot. Anyway, the final density is built by combining all these eroded cloud layers plus the rain layer and storm cell. The powder effect, which is a function of that final density, is applied using the albedo. Ambient occlusion is also built from top-down gradients applied to each cloud layer. It's also increased on rain clouds and storm cells. Finally, the emissive channel is built using the lightning strike lookup table technique I explained earlier. And voila, that's the cloud material packed into a neat little material function. The rest happens in blueprints. First, using Niagara, I sample the render targets driving the volumetric cloud material, plus the blend render target to send the current blend value, rain and storm amount at the player's position, to a blueprint. The rain and storm values received in that blueprint are then used to drive VFXs, particle spawn rate, sound intensity, enable lightning strikes, thunder and whatnot. Now, the blend value is an interesting data to have. I think the atmosphere plays a role as equally important as clouds when creating the look and feel of a specific weather, especially overcast skies, storms and so forth. Lots of fog, lots of moisture in the air, you get my point. So this weather data asset allows users to specify the most important atmosphere settings, like mist scattering, absorption and height fog. The thing is, those are global values. Say the height fog density. It's applied to the entire scene, right? So the following question arises. When to interpolate from one height fog density to the next when transitioning from one weather to the next? Over time, as the transition progresses? Well, that might work, but it's not without issues. Let's assume we are in-game and we are right here. The sky is clear, but a storm is slowly creeping in on us. Now, the weather transition is only technically done once the blend reaches the other side of the map, if that makes sense. So interpolating the various atmosphere settings based on that transition time alone might not cut it, right? The storm is on us way before the transition is over. And that's where having access to the weather blend value at our pawn's position comes handy. This value is what drives the interpolation of various atmosphere settings to make them based on the weather as it currently is above us. And it's not perfect, but it's the best I could come up with. Alright, what else? I never mentioned audio, and for a good reason. I suck at it. I know very little about meta sounds, so all I did was sample a couple of rain sounds of varying intensity. They are lerped using a single parameter set in blueprint based on the rain amount returned by Niagara. And same for the wind actually. Wind can be changed and the wind speed is fed to a meta sound to lerp different wind sounds. Nothing fancy. For thunder and lightning strikes, it's a bit different though. First, I have a Niagara system that spawns a couple of particles across the entire sky. Each particle samples the two render targets to get the cloud coverage and electricity amount. If the combined value is above a certain threshold, then this particle is kept alive and is thus a candidate for spawning a lightning strike at. I said candidate because the data of a single particle is sent to a blueprint. Thus, if multiple particles are alive, the one particle picked is going to be randomized from frame to frame. Therefore, if lightning strikes are enabled for this weather state, The blueprint gets this particle data and tries to spawn a lightning strike at that particle's position. And that blueprint owns a static mesh for the actual lightning strike VFX and plays a simple audio file at a world location upon spawn. The active lightning strikes are then sent to Niagara to create the lookup texture sampled in the volumetric cloud material and have them emit light. Similar principle for thunder, the same particle data is used, but instead of spawning a lightning strike, well, a simple sound is played at that location. And I believe that's it. There's an extra independent layer for the highest clouds, layer that relies on a plane with a simple translucent material. Cumulonimbus clouds. Beautiful. Now, I dare not say the amount of time I spent trying different solutions to create such clouds, and my final implementation is honestly still less than ideal. You see, I really wanted to create these distinctive storm clouds that go way higher in the sky than any other type of clouds. So high, in fact, that they may end up plateauing to create what's called an Anvil cloud. And I also wanted to see them grow and expand in a way that made at least some sense. And that proved to be a challenge, let's put it that way. Maybe I'm missing something obvious, I don't know. The main issue I faced is quite simple to understand. Let's say I have a cloud coverage signal of some sort. That's a 2D texture. Using a curve and a remap function, I can create the cloud vertical profile, right? It's something I explained a bunch of times already. And this is fine. It's a decent base to start with, I suppose. Except that, let's say my weather system outputs a coverage signal that is black at first, because there's no such cloud in the sky. And only then coverage for this type of cloud gradually fades in. See, clouds expand unnaturally both from the bottom and top layers at the same time, and those two layers can merge in thin, unpleasant vertical lines like so. And that's expected, right? The coverage is a 0 to 1 value, remapped to a certain range, based on this curve mapped from left to right using the normalized altitude. Thus, you can see that as the coverage value increases, the density fades in from both the top and bottom layers at the same time because of this curve profile. And for the life of me, I could not figure this out, and oh boy, I tried so many things. I don't know, I'm surely missing something obvious here. A part of my struggles was that I wanted to keep things simple. Anything you add to a volumetric material comes at a high cost because of ray marching, so you have to be cautious and keep things as simple as realistically possible. Thus, my goal was to make the most of this single coverage signal or texture. The idea was to constrain this remap function based on a height signal that increased over time as the cloud expanded, as to prevent the anvil, the top layer, from appearing too early. The thing is, the concept of a single cloud expanding doesn't really exist in this texture. It makes sense, visually, for us at least, when you look at this texture as a whole, but from the point of view of a single pixel, that coverage value alone doesn't tell a lot. Is that pixel part of a cloud over here that is fully expanded, or part of a cloud over there that just started expanding? You get my point. So my intuition for a long time was to try and somehow get that data, to somehow find the center of each quote-unquote cloud solely based on this coverage signal. Thus, I tried something akin to gradient descent, meaning sample the coverage texture at a pixel, and do that on neighboring pixels as well to derive a slope. Then, for each pixel, march a couple of steps along that slope upward to hopefully reach the highest local point, meaning, ideally, the cloud's center point, where the coverage is the highest. Sampling the coverage value at that location would ideally tell me how much the cloud as a whole has grown, and thus give me a way to somewhat control the cloud expansion in the vertical axis per pixel, and therefore prevent the anvil from forming way too early, if that makes sense. In practice, it translated to this. In Niagara, I sampled the coverage texture 3 times to compute its gradient. I initiate a vector 2D called UV at the current pixel, and using a couple of iterations, march along that gradient to end up with a new UV. Finally, I sample the coverage texture at that location and voila. In theory, each pixel can now sample the highest coverage value of the cloud it's part of, and it almost worked in a way. The biggest issue was the temporal instability as well as spatial instability due to a very noisy coverage texture and local minimas being a pitfall with gradient descent. Thus, I later tried to add temporal accumulation into the mix, as well as multi-sampling, and it cascaded into something way too complex, sketchy and costly to pursue this experiment any further. I also tried many other different things, but all failed, pretty much. I have a few more ideas to try, but I eventually decided to abandon the idea as is and to fall back to a much simpler but limited solution. Thus, my weather system is only able to spawn one cumulonimbus cloud at a time. That cloud has a position, radius and animation time that are updated in a simple blueprint and sent to the volumetric cloud material using float and vector parameters. In the material, the position and radius are then used to create a spherical gradient, distorted with some kind of noise, and the animation time allows me to create some intricate fade in and out animation and thus ensure the cloud expands somewhat decently. And that's pretty much it. Each weather data asset can control the chance of a storm cell appearing, if any, its duration, spawn rate and whatnot. And voila, that's a very broad overview of my weather system. It's not great by any means, but I suppose it gets the job done. Clouds do not look that great and could be improved for sure, but I have spent enough time on this project and my energy is running low, so time to move on. Throughout the video, I mentioned building custom tools to paint a cloud mask, to paint a flow map, bake distance fields and whatnot, all in engine. So let's have a look, shall we? Let's begin with a scriptable tool. This one allows me to paint an RGB mask or a flow map in editor. I'll keep the breakdown somewhat brief because I already have videos on my YouTube channel explaining how to build similar tools and explaining their underlying fundamental principles, like working with render targets, switching from unit to world space and so on and so forth. Here I just want to show you what's possible. So the first order of business when working with scriptable tools is to handle the property set. This property set blueprint contains all the variables the user is allowed to tweak, and adding this set to the scriptable tool is what exposes these variables here. I use a watch property node to bind an event for each variable in case it's tweaked by the user in the interface, so that I can keep the scriptable tool's variable up to date. I also read the property set default values to initiate the scriptable tool's variables. Next comes what I call getting the volumetric cloud context. Pay attention to this function because I pretty much used it in all my tools. A simple get all actors of class node allows me to get the volumetric cloud actor, from which I can get the volumetric cloud component, from which I can get the volumetric cloud material. That material could be a material instance, but it could not. So I may have to create one, and if so, I update the volumetric cloud material. That material instance is expected to have two vector parameters, very important. Their names may vary and may be customized, but they need to exist and must be used to map the texture I'm going to paint onto. It's basically a position and a scale to tell where that mask or flow map is projected in world space. That texture, that map, must also be a parameter with a specific name so the scriptable tool can get it. Oh, and by the way, that's a simple material function to sample that RGB mask to, in turn, sample different cloud profile textures like I previously explained. This cloud material is crap and clouds look like hot garbage, but that's not the point. The point is that this volumetric cloud material makes use of an RGB mask parameter texture to create cloud coverage in some way. And that texture is mapped using the absolute world position. Thus, to go from centimeters to UVs, it uses a scale parameter and an optional offset parameter. Parameters that the tool must get to recreate the same mapping coordinates, right? Say if all the tool has access to is a brush or cursor position in world space, that position has to be converted to UVs to paint at the correct location in the texture, if that makes sense. And that's an important concept to grasp because I used it across all my tools, pretty much. That means the volumetric cloud material has to be set up in a specific way for this tool to work. Hence why I built a material function that you can just drag and drop. And that's also why I exposed settings in the Tools panel to optionally look for material parameters that have different names. Anyway, so in that scriptable tool, from that material I get the mapping origin and scale in centimeters. From that material instance, I also retrieve the texture to paint onto. If that's a static texture, I create a render target of matching size. But if it's a render target already, then great, I have nothing to do. In case I had to create a render target though, I update the cloud materials texture to point to that render target instead, just while I'm painting. That render target is blank though, so I need to copy whatever was in the texture in that render target first, as to not erase clouds or flow as soon as I start painting, right? So I do that using a simple material to sample the original texture and write it into the render target. And that's step 1. I have the volumetric cloud component, the material, the mapping coordinates, and the render target to paint into. Step 2, the brush actor. I went all in and did something fancy, but you could use a draw debug circle and it would functionally be the same. So here I spawn the actor. It doesn't do much, merely owns the static mesh component. It's a bit of a bizarre mesh. It's 3 meshes packed into one, and I used UVs to pack data and differentiate these meshes in the shader. Speaking of, the material is a simple translucent material. Again, I do some shenanigan with UVs to distinguish the top and bottom planes from the cylinder and drive different colors and whatnot, but that's not important. Once that brush is spawned, I set its radius, meaning I scale it in X and Y to match the user-specified brush radius. Same for the sharpness, the brush has an inner cylinder that is scaled in X and Y to visualize the brush fall off. Not important. I also get the cloud component, the one I got when retrieving the volumetric cloud context, right? To have access to the cloud layer bottom altitude and height. That tells me where to position this actor in Z and how tall it needs to be to perfectly match the cloud layer. Voila, upon script setup, this brush actor is spawned and located at 0, 0 in X and Y, but matches the cloud layer in Z. Now, to position the brush in X and Y with a cursor, it gets a bit more complicated. That happens in the scriptable tools onHoverHeatTest function. In that function, I get the hover position, the cloud layer bottom altitude and height, and that allows me to derive the normalized altitude, which in turn allows me to tell if the viewport is in the cloud layer and thus if the cursor is as well. Else, if I'm below the cloud layer, I do a line plane intersection test against the bottom layer looking from below. Else, if I'm above the cloud layer, I do a line plane intersection test against the top layer looking from above. If any of those tests resulted in an intersection, I return, well, I hit. And that triggers the onHoverUpdate function, where I essentially do the same. I call the same trace function to know where the cursor intersects with the cloud layer in world space. Therefore, I can move the brush actor to that position and I ensure the brush has the correct height. Neat. What about painting though? That's the third and last step. Buckle up, I'll be brief. It starts with the scriptable tools test if can begin click drag function, where I do once again the same thing. I get the cursor, trace for the cloud layer, and that's it. Returning a hit calls the onDrag begin event and starts a stream of onDrag update position events until the test function returns false and the onDrag end event is called. They all pretty much do the same thing, as you can see. This Paint Clouds Mask function is where the magic happens. First, I make sure the cloud context is up to date. I trace again for the cloud layer to get a cursor position, but I also keep in mind the last cursor position. The position delta, thus the cursor movement, allows me to paint flow instead of a color if I choose to. That's the only difference between painting a flow map and painting a mask. Next, I create an instance of the brush material. Basically, that's the brush position in a 0 to 1 range. Therefore, using UVs, I can draw a sphere mask around the brush position. I do that 4 times to support tiling. The resulting brush mask is then used to either erase stuff from the render target or paint stuff onto it. Anyway, all I got to do now is to configure this material, meaning send the brush coordinates in a 0 to 1 range. And that's where the offset and scale I retrieved from the cloud material come into play, so I may know where the cursor world position corresponds to in the texture. Again, that's a topic I covered in depth in previous videos. I also send the brush movement to paint flow if needed. Then comes brush opacity, radius, fall-off, inputs, channel, texture and whatnot. Once that material instance has that data, it's written into the cloud render target. And voila, that's it for this tool. The render target can then be converted to a static texture once painting is done. Now, painting clouds is cool, but I thought a stamp approach would be nice as well. Meaning, use actors to draw specific textures into a specific channel of the cloud mask render target. The end result is essentially the same. An RGB mask texture that you can use in many ways in your cloud shader. Now this tool comes in 2 parts. There's the stamp blueprint and the stamp manager blueprint. The manager blueprint has a paint function called in the construction script, and the stamp blueprint also calls this manager's paint function in the construction script. That way, stamps are painted when either a stamp is updated or the manager is. Thus, the magic happens in that paint function. First, I get the volumetric cloud context, same thing as before. I get the volumetric cloud actor, from which I get the volumetric cloud component, material, mapping coordinates, and then texture. Next, I get all stamps in the scene. Then I create an instance of the stamp material. That's the cloud mask texture to which I simply add the stamp texture mapped with specific coordinates to translate, rotate and scale the stamp texture according to the stamp actor's transform. It's lazily repeated 8 more times to support tiling. There are smarter ways to do this, but whatever, performance isn't a concern here, it's an offline tool. So next I reset the render target. And for each stamp, I configure that stamp material instance I just showed, meaning I provide the stamp texture, stamp rotation, position and scale, computed based on the mapping settings retrieved from the volumetric cloud material. Again, the idea is that this mask's texture is projected at a certain location in the world with a certain size, right? So having that location and size, the goal is to transform them from world to UV space. Once that's done, it can be drawn into the render target. Repeat that for all stamps and done. Thanks to this additive process, each stamp is added to the render target and voila! You can experiment with tons of tools related to volumetric clouds. Here's one more. Word of caution, it's way more involved, so I'll be brief. It relies on the same 2D stamp method I described earlier, where actors are used to draw textures into a render target, yeah? However, now these actors can be much more easily controlled using an editor utility widget. I can select one, move it, rotate it, scale it. It supports styling, cursor wraps around the window when manipulating the actor, and so on and so forth. Very neat. What's cool about this tool though is that it features a paint layer. The idea is that the 2D stamps is like your base layer that you can further tweak with a cool painting tool. You can add to the stamp layer to create clouds, right? Or remove from it to erase clouds. And the tool includes cool features like brush position, angle and scale jitter. And then you can of course bake the resulting mask texture and do what you want with it in a cloud material. Cool. I won't bore you with a breakdown though. It took quite a bit of effort to make and it'd be quite tedious to explain, but I'll show you one trick. That stamp actor selection feature. So in that editor utility widget, in the onMouse move function, I get the mouse event input. I also get the render target image, and that's just an image widget that uses a material to draw the stamp texture, right? Nothing fancy. Anyway, that function allows me to get the cursor position relative to this image widget in a 0 to 1 range. Having that normalized position, I can convert it to a position in world space using the volumetric cloud material texture mapping, the origin and scale. Again, that's the mapping parameters the volumetric cloud material has to have for this tool to work at all. That's what creates the render target mapping coordinates in the cloud material using the absolute world position as input, and thus what also allows the tool to create a world position to UV conversion, or the other way around, UV to world position. Having the cursor position in world space, I can then loop through each stamp actor and figure out if that cursor world position is inside their 2D box. And in the event the cursor overlaps multiple stamps, I simply loop through them all to get the closest one. Having that stamp upon, say, left mouse button, I can say, hey, this stamp is now selected. And to provide a selection visual cue, I draw a simple semi-opaque image on top of that stamp. Therefore, it has to be positioned on top of the stamp in image space, meaning if that background image is, say, 1024 by 1024, somehow compute a pixel coordinate in that range, right? So I get the selected stamp's world location and see where that corresponds to in UV space. Thus, based on the background image size, I can compute a pixel coordinate and thus simply update the semi-opaque image render translation. And the same principle applies for the scale and rotation, which are based on the actor's scale and rotation. And you can keep iterating on that. Like, moving a stamp is just a matter of offsetting the actor based on the cursor delta. Rotating a stamp is a bit more complex, especially when having to wrap the cursor around, but in a nutshell, when the rotate tool is started, I take a snapshot of the selected stamp's transform and store where the cursor was at that time. That way I can compare this information with where the cursor now is and derive any kind of transform that I want, rotation and scale. There's obviously a bit more to it than that, but yeah, this tool is complex enough that it would probably deserve its own breakdown video, so let's move on. Now that's great and all, but could the same be done with volume textures? Could 3D textures be drawn into a 3D mask texture? Sadly, support for volume render targets in blueprints is pretty much non-existent. It's doable using Niagara though, but it's sketchy. Here's how I went about it. Word of caution, it's a bit tricky because it involves a dual space switching thingy, meaning the 3D mask texture used in the volumetric cloud material is sampled using the absolute world position. So to go from centimeters to a UVW coordinate, there's the first space transforms to take into account, right? But then to render a 3D stamp in that 3D mask's texture, each stamp also needs UVW coordinates relative to the volume this 3D mask texture is mapped to, if that makes sense. Hence why I mentioned a dual space switching thingy. Anyway, let's give it a try. The stamp actor now owns a box trigger to visualize its volume and has a user-exposed volume texture variable. A Niagara system is then used to draw that 3D texture into a volume render target, the 3D mask texture, the one meant to be sampled in the volumetric cloud material, right? So here I create a grid 3D and a render target volume at the emitter level. The grid 3D is configured to contain as many voxels as the volume texture. Next, similar to the previous tools, I need to know where in world space that volume texture is mapped in the volumetric cloud material and its scale. That's information provided by the blueprint, more on that in a second. So with this origin and scale, I create a simple unit-to-world matrix. Again, I already explained this concept extensively in my neighbor grid 3D beginner to expert video. Then, using a first simulation stage on simulation reset, I initiate the grid and set a vector 4 to 0. Next comes writing the stamp's 3D texture into the grid. So there's a whole bunch of space switching to do because the grid, that is for now a unit grid, corresponds to a volume in world space based on the volumetric cloud material mapping. That's the role of the unit to world space matrix, right? That gives the grid a location and a scale in the world, right? And thus, for each grid cell, that gives me the cell position in world space. Then I need to switch space a second time because I need to know what UVW coordinate this world position corresponds to in order to sample the stamp 3D texture. And that's based on the stamp's transform, right? And I could use another transform matrix here, but whatever, I just apply transforms by hand in the right order. Meaning first undo the stamp location, then undo the stamp rotation, and undo the stamp scale to be back in unit space. Center the volume texture on the stamp's location, and that's the UVW coordinate to sample the stamp's 3D texture at. I'm not sure if that makes any sense, but yeah, this is a video on volumetric clouds after all, not on Niagara and space switching. But I figured I might show different tools you can build related to volumetric clouds, so I'm trying my best to keep the breakdown concise enough. Anyway, here I do a bunch of shenanigans to composite the 3D distance field texture onto the volume render target, and I ensure I always write the minimum distance. That plus a box mask to ensure pixels outside the stamp are discarded. The last step is to output the grid and write the volume render target. Now that's great, that allows me to write a 3D distance field using an actor that I can move, rotate and scale at will into a volume render target mapped in a certain area. It's similar in principle to UE's global distance field, right? Where each object's own distance field is injected into a single 3D texture at the scene level. That's kinda what I'm doing here. But so far, that's for one actor. How to bake multiple 3D stamps. Niagara doesn't support arrays of 3D textures, as far as I know. So my solution is to gather all 3D stamp actors and using a tick event in engine, loop through each stamp one by one and composite its 3D texture into the volume render target. And one way to have access to a tick event in engine is via editor utility widgets. First of all, editor utility widgets have access to special widgets called single property views. And preconstruct calls that widget's setObject function and sends self to tell that widget, hey, there's a variable in that blueprint I want you to look for. Say a variable named SDF scale name. That one, see? And that creates a very handy widget for you to tweak that variable in a very intuitive manner. But I digress. Upon clicking this widget's bake button, I get all 3D stamp actors. I also built a simple wait mechanism using a frame counter. And this is a hack to get rid of issues related to Niagara variables being set with a 1 frame delay, likely due to CPU-GPU synchronization, not important. It really just allows me to wait for a couple of frames. So on editor tick, I check that frame counter to ensure Niagara is ready to go. Next, in that paint function, I get the volumetric cloud context, same thing as before, I get the volumetric cloud actor, component, material, 3D texture mapping coordinates, volume render target, and so on and so forth. Next, I ensure Niagara actor is spawned and I set its system asset. That's the Niagara system I just explained, right? Then I get the first stamp actor on the stack. I get its 3D texture, and I configure the Niagara system. That's the 3D mask texture sampled in the volumetric cloud material. That's the stamp's 3D texture. That's the scale and offset used to map the 3D mask texture in the cloud material. That's the stamp rotation described with its 3 major axes. And that's the stamp size and origin. That's the data used to create the double space switching thing I briefly explained earlier. When that's done, this stamp is removed from the stack and Niagara does its thing. Next frame, I repeat the process to go through all stamps, and when the stack is empty, the bake is complete. And this results in a very bizarre looking 3D texture, but it works. This global 3D distance field texture can be sampled and remapped in the volumetric cloud with techniques I explained earlier in the video. Speaking of distance field, there are a couple of ways to bake a mesh distance field into a 3D texture in UE. Geometry scripting is one of them. This generated dynamic mesh actor has one single function called bake. In that function, I first get its dynamic mesh and I reset it. Next, I copy a mesh from a static mesh asset. I then build a BVH tree for that mesh. I derive the mesh's extent and center point from its bounding box. Bounding box that is drawn for debug purposes. Next, I pre-allocate the voxel array, meaning as many entries as there are voxels in the 3D distance field. For each voxel in Z, for each voxel in Y, and for each voxel in X, I compute that voxel's position in mesh space, meaning I center the position on the voxel, I remap it to a 0 to 1 range using the voxel count, and then to centimeters using the mesh's extent. And then it's centered on the mesh extent and then on the mesh's origin. At that voxel location, I use the BVH structure to query the nearest point on the mesh. And how far that nearest point is to the sample point gives me the distance field. And it can be converted into a signed distance field by knowing if the sample point is inside the mesh. And that's it really. Oh, and I also keep track of the greatest distance. Once that's done, I can choose to normalize the distance field using the greatest distance recorded. Finally, I send that array and the voxel count to Niagara. Niagara is basically the go-to solution when you want to manipulate volume render targets. Here I set a grid 3D interface and render target volume at the emitter level. In hindsight, the grid 3D interface wasn't necessary, but whatever. They both are configured to contain the required amount of cells and voxels in X, Y, and Z. Then, using a first simulation stage, I iterate the grid 3D. And since I know for sure the grid contains as many voxels as entries in the array provided by the blueprint, I can just access this array using the cell's linear index to get the signed distance computed for that cell and fill the grid. And then the grid 3D is written into a volume render target. And that's the result. Now, when you think about it, that's quite stupid. UE has a built-in method to generate distance fields, and UE has this texture in memory. Sadly though, as far as I know, there's no way to get it or export it. You can however sample it, and I built another tool to try that. The result is a bit sketchy. The distance field is unnormalized, and depends on the static mesh distance field resolution in the first place, but it works. Here I create a volume render target parameter at the emitter level. I know its size is 32 pixels cubed, so I can use a direct set on a simulation stage to dispatch that many elements in X, Y, and Z. For each element, I convert the render target volume execution index to unit, so I can sample the static mesh distance field based on its bounds and whatnot. The result is written into the volume render target, and that's it. Sketchy, but it works. Speaking of baking, here's another tool I experimented with. It allows me to bake a volumetric cloud material into a pseudo-volume texture, which can in turn be converted into a volume texture to be sampled in the volumetric cloud material. Thus, you can likely create an expensive cloud material, bake it, and sample the resulting 3D texture for cheap. Obviously, you have to work with the usual constraints that comes with bakes. Limited texture resolution, especially 3D textures, it's static and so on and so forth. But who knows, it may be a useful tool to have around. So this blueprint has a bake function where I get the volumetric cloud context, same as before. I then do a couple of safety checks, and I create a dynamic instance of the cloud material to bake. Now, that's not the volumetric cloud material, but it's almost a one-to-one copy, and there's a very good reason for it. The volumetric cloud material, when rendered, has access to plenty of data, the absolute world position, the cloud attributes, and whatnot. But when baking that volumetric cloud material, meaning when this material is rendered into a render target, that information is obviously lost. The shader no longer has the view context to reconstruct the world position from the depth buffer and so forth, if that makes sense. All it has access to is the render target UVs. So the goal then is to use the render target UVs to reconstruct that missing data. But how though? UVs are 2D and I need to reconstruct an XYZ world position as well as the cloud altitude. Well, this bake function is going to create a pseudo-volume texture, meaning it's going to render slices of that 3D volume one after the other. So the Z position is going to be set during a for loop. With this 3D box, I can define the area to bake, right? So for each slice, based on the box's location and bounds, I can very easily tell the slice's Z position. Let's get a closer look at the blueprint. Once that dynamic material instance is created, I create a render target to render the pseudo-volume texture into. Next, that's what I just explained. Using the box location and extent, I can compute its bottom altitude in world space, and therefore know where that is in Z in the cloud layer, and get each slice height in centimeters and plenty of other information related to Z. The X and Y position can then be recreated from UVs in the material given the box location and extent. Next, for each slice, I tell the shader where that slice is in Z, and I also provide a bunch of information related to Z. And finally, I also tell the shader the pseudo-volume texture frame to render before it's rendered. So why is this material a copy of the volumetric cloud material to bake? Well, it's a copy because every time I use the absolute world position in the original cloud material I want to bake, I now need to use the XYZ position reconstructed from the data sent in the blueprint and the render target UVs. And same for the cloud attributes. I hope that makes sense. And that essentially allows me to recreate the very same cloud material at a very specific location and at a very specific altitude, a slice. And so each slice is rendered one after the other and composited into the render target using a simple 2D box mask. Next, convert that pseudo-volume texture to a volume texture, and voila! You can get rid of pretty much everything in your cloud material and just sample the baked 3D density texture. And that's basically how that bake tool works. Quite neat. Again, at first, I thought it might be kinda useless, but then reading a paper on the voxel renderer implemented in Horizon Forbidden West and realizing they baked a low-resolution 3D texture of their entire cloudscape that they then upscale using smart techniques made me think this tool may not be that useless after all. And turns out I actually had a use for it. You might know your way around volumetric clouds, but there's a chance you've never heard of empty space skipping, and for good reasons. It's completely undocumented for one, and two, it was some kind of internal experiment that didn't necessarily deliver on its promise. It comes back to the idea of being able to skip samples where there's empty space, but to know where empty space is, you have to sample the volumetric clouds in the first place. It's like you're chasing your own tail, right? And so empty space skipping seems to be a popular technique when sampling volumetric data to provide the shader with some kind of acceleration structure to very roughly tell where that empty space is and where expensive computation can be skipped. Unreal's implementation of empty space skipping seems to allow the ray to be started at a much more convenient time and, like the name implies, skip a lot of empty space. According to the developer, that feature, however, apparently didn't result in the expected performance boost and is quite constraining to work with, so not much was publicly said about it. I asked Sébastien some more info via email and he was kind enough to answer me, shout out to him. So first you have to enable it using a console command. Next, you have to be able to tell the empty space skipping path, hey, at that position in space, within that spherical area, there's no cloud quote-unquote matter. And that's the constraining and tricky part. Assuming I understood that feature correctly, the only way you're able to get that information is to know how distant is the closest cloud quote-unquote surface at any position. Meaning have a 3D distance field of the cloudscape. And I wasn't sure how to do that exactly, but then I had an idea and that's where my bake tool I just explained a minute ago came into play. First, I baked this simple volumetric cloud material into a 3D texture, okay? Then, using a Niagara system, I sampled the 3D texture and assumed any density greater than 0 means there's cloud quote-unquote matter in that cell. That's what this feature asks for, right? Thus, that gave me a binary matter-no matter 3D texture, if that makes sense. Next, still using Niagara and the jump float algorithm, and by the way, once again, I already made an extensive video on that subject, so I'll be very brief here. I propagated that binary mask outward based on minimum distance to create a 3D distance field. Meaning a 3D texture where each voxel has a distance to the closest cloud matter. Finally, I sampled the resulting 3D distance field at the desired position and with the desired size, and scaled the normalized distance according to the mapping size. And if the distance to the nearest surface, sampled at this position, is smaller than this radius, there's matter. And that's it. With that data, the empty space skipping feature can do its thing to compute a better start position for the ray tracing, and like the name implies, skip empty space, I think. I'm not entirely confident about my understanding of that feature, to be totally honest. Anyway, it's a bit constraining to work with, right? You need a baked 3D distance field of your cloudscape, meaning that feature likely won't work with dynamic cloudscapes. And by the way, having a 3D distance field, it's my understanding that you can leverage that data to add sphere tracing to speed up the rain marching. I just discovered this, by the way, it's really cool. Rather than marching at a regular interval along the ray, now that you know the distance to the closest surface, you know for sure you can take a step at least that far ahead before having a chance to encounter more density. So it's a tremendous optimization, one used in Horizon Forbidden West, I think. I'm not too sure, they mention cone tracing, so I could be mistaken. It's something I'm not yet familiar with. Anyway, it's been close to 2 months since I last released a video on my YouTube channel, and this is the reason why. Turns out volumetric clouds rendering is a huge topic, and I fell into a rabbit hole I've yet to dig myself out of. Oh, and I slept for 2 weeks straight because of COVID, so that didn't help, but that's another story. Enough said about empty space keeping though. It's honestly not a feature you should need, but I still wanted to mention it. It's something you may have stumbled upon in the material graph, so hopefully this brief interlude on that feature shed a tiny bit of light onto it. When it first got introduced, using volumetric clouds in Unreal Engine was very confusing. The documentation was severely lacking, and support was experimental and mostly provided via this Volumetrics plugin. To this day, still, you can see a lot of tutorials suggesting you have to use the volumetric cloud actors and other stuff you can find in this plugin to make use of volumetric clouds. Hopefully, having made it this far into the video, you should realize that's no longer the case. And it never really was, to be honest. You could build everything from scratch from day one. However, this Volumetrics plugin is definitely still worth looking into. It comes with different tools to bake noise textures, great volume textures, a couple of cloud material examples, tools to bake cloud profile textures from curves, and so on and so forth. It's a bit chaotic to look through, it's not organized at all, and some experimental painting tools it comes with are in a sketchy state and hard to get working, but yeah. Using these blueprints, for instance, like suggested in early days, is not required at all. This cloud actor draws a texture into a 2D render target to create a cloudscape RGB mask, just like I explained earlier, and you can recreate your own, more modern version of that tool using scriptable tools and whatnot, just like I did. Reading papers on volumetric clouds, you get to hear a lot about Worley Noise, and it definitely caught my attention, so I thought I'd quickly mention it. What is it and how is it generated? Turns out it's very smart. The idea is the following. For each pixel, get its UV and multiply it by an arbitrary value, say 16. That number dictates the amount of quote-unquote spheres in the Worley Noise in each axis. Next, floor that position to get a tile index. Use that x and y index as a seed to generate a random 2D value using any kind of random number generator. That's to randomize the quote-unquote Worley sphere or point within each tile, okay? Having that tile index for that pixel, the next step is to do a for loop to iterate the 8 neighboring tiles, for 2D Worley Noise at least. For 3D noise, same thing, but iterate the 26 neighboring tiles in a cube, right? And small but important detail, to get a tiling Worley noise, if that neighboring tile index overflows, wrap it around, if that makes sense. That's all. Then, during the for loop, for each neighboring tile, generate a random 2D value based on their indexes to get the randomized position of each neighboring point and return the distance to the closest point. And that smallest distance is the grayscale value of this pixel. Repeat this for all pixels and done. Worley Noise. Very smart and efficient algorithm, and it's actually nearly identical in principle to Perlin Noise. You can then do another pass with more points this time and composite the result onto the previous noise with a lerp, add or max or any other math operator. Some lead to crazy looking noises. Anyway, that's called an octave. Keep generating octaves and diminish their influence the higher the octave to end up with a layered Worley Noise texture. Really cool. And turns out Niagara is perfectly able to generate a tiling 3D Worley Noise texture. Here I set a grid 3D interface and a render target volume at the emitter level. Here I configure the number of octaves and their persistence, meaning how much the higher octaves participate in the end result. Next, I set the number of pixels in the grid 3D and render target volume, which are then configured in that custom module. And finally, that's the amount of Worley points or spheres to generate. Using a first simulation stage, I iterate the grid 3D to initialize a vector 4 value I called RGBA. Next, using another simulation stage that is called once per octave, I iterate the grid 3D to, this time, generate the Worley Noise. And that's done using HLSL, but I won't dive into the code. I am already going off track enough in this video. This is supposed to be about clouds, but whatever. Feel free to pause the video and take a look at the code. The result is then composited into the previous RGBA value using different methods. I prefer the LERP. And finally, using a final simulation stage, that RGBA vector 4 is written into the render target volume. Really cool. The Horizon paper mentions Perlin-Worley noise. As the name implies, it's essentially a mix between Worley and Perlin noise, and it's totally doable in Niagara, but you don't need to. That 3D texture you can find in the Volumetric plugin is a perfect duplicate of what was described in that paper. Perlin-Worley noise in the red channel and Worley noise of increasing frequencies in the remaining channels, so you're good to go. I was just curious and tried to generate my own texture. You might also want to check out Sébastien Hiller's GitHub page. There's a tileable volume noise CPP project that I believed was used to generate this specific 3D Perlin-Worley noise texture. I'm not 100% sure, but yeah, something you might look into. Cool stuff. And it looks like I finally ran out of things to say. And honestly, I don't feel like there's a lot more to say on the subject. The many techniques and tools I demonstrated in this video should be all you need to come up with your preferred workflow to create any kind of cloudscape and are, to my knowledge, the very same techniques commonly used in the video game industry to create volumetric clouds, weather VFXs and systems. The devil lies in the details and things may not be done exactly like I demonstrated in this video, but I'd argue it's most often quite close. As usual, it's all about understanding and mastering the key principles, and then you can likely figure out the details on your own. I hope I made sense. I tried my best, I really did. I covered a lot of ground though, and I suspect some of the more advanced stuff I explained may be a bit hard to follow for beginners, but then it's also quite an impossible task to teach such advanced topics for extreme beginners in 3 hours time, so I had to take a few shortcuts. Again, feel free to ask questions in the comments below if you have any. This video took a huge effort to produce, so I'd appreciate a like and a subscribe if you liked the video. The project is available as a tier 3 reward on my Patreon and includes a crap ton of examples, plus all the cool tools I demonstrated in this video. Keep in mind, I intend for this to be an educational project first and foremost. This is by no means an alternative to Ultra Dynamic Sky, Sky Creator or similar solutions that you can find on the marketplace. Anyway, my Patreon page is the sole reason I'm able to create that kind of content, so any support is much appreciated. You can find plenty of awesome projects, tools and assets on it. Speaking of support, a huge thanks to all my patrons for their incredible generosity and patience. I cannot thank you guys enough. You're the best. And thanks to you for watching. I hope you found the video useful and have fun making clouds. I'll see you in the next video. In the meantime, take care of yourself. Merry Christmas. Bye bye.